Hello and welcome to the CrimeUK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Today we look at the infamous serial killer Harold Shipman, aka the Angel of Death, and how he left a deep, unforgiving imprint on the UK. Harold Frederick Shipman, born on the 14th of January 1946, died on the 13th of January 2004. Known to acquaintances as Fred Shipman, was an English general practitioner who is believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. On the 31st of January 2000, Mr. Shipman was found guilty of murdering 15 patients under his care. His total number of victims was approximately 250. Mr. Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment with the recommendation that he never be released. Mr. Shipman died by suicide, hanging himself in his cell at HM Prison Wakefield, West Yorkshire on the 13th of January 2004, a day before his 58th birthday. The Shipman Inquiry, a 2-year-long investigation of all deaths certified by Mr. Shipman, which Dame Janet Smith chaired, examined Mr. Shipman's crimes. The inquiry identified 218 victims and estimated his total victim count at 250, about 80% of whom were elderly women. Mr. Shipman's youngest confirmed victim was a 41-year-old man, although suspicion arose that he had killed the patients as young as 4. Mr. Shipman is the only British doctor to have been found guilty of murdering his patients, although other doctors have been acquitted of similar crimes or convicted on lesser charges. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on the 14th of January 1946 on the Bestwood Council estate in Nottingham, Nottinghamshire. Mr. Shipman, second of 3 children of Harold Frederick Shipman Sr., born on the 12th of May 1914, and died on the 5th of January 1985, a truck driver, and Viren Britton, born on the 23rd of December 1919 and died on the 21st of June 1963. Mr. Shipman's working class parents were devout Methodists. When growing up, Mr. Shipman was an accomplished rugby player in youth leagues. Mr. Shipman passed his 11 plus in 1957, moving to High Pavement Grammar School, Nottingham, which later he left in 1964. Mr. Shipman excelled as a distance runner and in his final years at school served as vice captain of the athletics team. Mr. Shipman was particularly close to his mother, Vera, who died of lung cancer when Harold was just 17. Harold's mother's death came in a manner similar to what later became Mr. Shipman's own MO. In later stages of her disease, she had morphine administered at home by a doctor. Mr. Shipman witnessed his mother's pain subside despite her terminal condition until her death on the 21st of June 1963. On the 5th of November 1966, Mr. Shipman married Primrose May Oxtoby. The couple had 4 children. Mr. Shipman studied medicine at Leeds School of Medicine, University of Leeds, graduating in 1970. Mr. Shipman began working at Pontefract General Infirmary in Pontefract, West Riding of Yorkshire, and in 1974 took his first position as a general practitioner at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre in Todmorden. In the following year, Mr. Shipman was caught forging prescriptions of pethidine for his own use. Mr. Shipman was fined £600 and briefly attended a drug rehabilitation clinic in York. Mr. Shipman became a GP at a Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde, near Manchester in 1977. Mr. Shipman continued working as a GP in Hyde throughout the 1980s and established his own surgery at 21 Market Street in 1993, becoming a respected member of the community. In 1983, Mr. Shipman was interviewed in an edition of Grenada television documentary World in Action on how the mentally ill should be treated in the community. A year after Mr. Shipman's conviction, the interview was rebroadcast on Tonight with Trevor McDonald. In March 1998, Linda Reynolds of Bruck Surgery in Hyde expressed concerns to John Pollard, the coroner of the South Manchester district, about the high death rate among Mr. Shipman's patients. In particular, she was concerned about a large number of cremation forms for elderly women that Mr. Shipman had needed to be countersigned. Police were unable to find sufficient evidence to bring charges and close the investigation on the 17th of April. The Shipman Inquiry later blamed the Greater Manchester Police for assigning inexperienced officers to the case. After the investigation was closed, Mr. Shipman went to kill on 3 more people. In August, taxi driver John Shaw told the police that he suspected Mr. Shipman of murdering 21 patients. John Shaw became suspicious of many of the elderly customers Mr. Shipman took to the hospital, who seemed to be in good health but died under Shipman's care. Mr. Shipman's last victim was Kathleen Grundy, who was found dead at her home on the 24th of June 1998. Mr. Shipman was the last person to see her alive, and he later signed Mrs. Grundy's death certificate recording the cause of death as old age. Mrs. Grundy's daughter, lawyer Angela Woodruff, became concerned when solicitor Brian Burgess informed her that a will had been made, apparently by her mother, which was raised doubts about its authenticity. The will excluded Angela Woodruff and her children but left £386,000 to Mr. Shipman. At Burgess's urging, Mrs. Woodruff went to the police, who began an investigation. Miss Grundy's body was exhumed and found to contain traces of diamorphine, often used for pain control in terminal cancer patients. Mr. Shipman claimed that Miss Grundy had been an addict and showed them comments he had written to that effect in his computerized medical journal. However, examination on his computer showed that they were written after her death. Mr. Shipman was arrested on the 7th of September 1998 and was found to own a Brother typewriter, that kind used to make the forged will. Prescription for Murder, a 2000s book by journalists Brian Whittle and Jean Ritchie, suggested that Mr. Shipman forged the will either because he wanted to be caught, or because his life was out of control, or even because he planned to retire at 55 and leave the UK with his small fortune. The police investigated over other deaths Mr. Shipman had certified and investigated 15 specimen cases. The police discovered a pattern of his administering lethal doses of diamorphine, signing patients' death certificates, and then falsifying medical records to indicate that they had been in poor health. In 2003, David Spogelhalter et al. Suggested that statistical monitoring could have led to an alarm being raised at the end of 1996, when there was 67 excess deaths in females aged over 65 years, compared with 119 by 1998. Harold Shipman's trial began at Preston Crown Court on the 5th of October 1999. Mr. Shipman was charged with 15 murders of women by lethal injection of diamorphine, all between 1995 and 1998. Mr. Shipman's legal representatives tried unsuccessfully to have Mrs. Grundy's case tried separately from the others, as a motive was shown by the allegedly forged of Mrs. Grundy's will. On the 31st of January 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury found Mr. Shipman guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. Mr. Justice Forbay subsequently sentenced Mr. Shipman to life imprisonment on all 15 counts of murder, with a recommendation that he never be released, to be served concurrently with the sentence of 4 years for forging Mrs. Grundy's will. On the 11th of February, 10 days after his conviction, Mr. Shipman was struck off by the General Medical Council. 2 years later, Home Secretary David Blunkett confirmed the judge's whole life tariff, just months before the British government ministers lost their power to set minimum terms for prisoners. While authorities could have brought many additional charges, they concluded that a fair hearing would be impossible in view of the enormous publicity surrounding the original trial. Furthermore, the 15 life sentences already handed down rendered further litigation unnecessary. Mr. Shipman became friends with fellow serial killer Peter Moore while incarcerated. Mr. Shipman consistently denied his guilt, disputing the scientific evidence against him, and he was never made any public statements about his actions. Mr. Shipman's wife, Primrose, steadfastly maintained her husband's innocence even after his conviction. Harold Shipman is the only doctor in the history of British medicine found guilty of murdering his patients, giving him the nickname the Angel of Death. John Bodkin Adams was charged in 1957 with murdering a patient, amid rumours he had killed dozens more over a 10-year period, and possibly provided the role model for Mr. Shipman. However, John Adams was acquitted of those rumours. Historian Pamela Cullen has argued that because of Mr. Adams's acquittal, there was no impetus to examine the flaws in the British legal system until Mr. Shipman's case was brought to light. Harold Shipman hung himself in his cell at HM Prison Wakefield at 6:20 am on the 13th of January 2004, the eve of his 58th birthday, and was pronounced dead at 8:20 am by prison staff. A statement from Her Majesty's Prison Service indicated that Mr. Shipman had hanged himself from the window bars of his cell using bedsheets. After Mr. Shipman's death, his body was taken to the mortuary at the Medico Legal Centre for a post-mortem examination. The West Yorkshire coroner David Hinchliffe eventually released Mr. Shipman's body to the family after an inquest was opened and adjourned shortly after. Some of the victims' families said they felt cheated, as Mr. Shipman's suicide meant they would never have the satisfaction of his confession, nor answers as to why he committed his crimes. Home Secretary David Blunkett said the celebration was tempting. You wake up and you receive a call telling you Mr. Shipman has topped himself, and you think, is it too early to open a bottle? And then you discover that everybody's very upset that he's done it. Mr. Shipman's death divided national newspapers, with the likes of the Daily Mirror branding him a cold coward and condemning the prison service for allowing him to commit suicide. However, the likes of The Sun ran a celebratory front page headline, "Ship, ship, hooray." The Independent called for the inquiry into Mr. Shipman's suicide to look more widely at the state of the UK prisons, as well as the welfare of its inmates. And lastly, in The Guardian, an article by General Sir David Ramsbotham, who was formerly served as Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons, suggested that the whole life sentencing be replaced by indefinite sentencing, for this would at least give prisoners the hope of eventual release and reduce the risk of their ending own lives by suicide, as well as making their management easier for the prison officials. Mr. Shipman's motive for suicide was never established, though he reportedly told his probation officer that he was considering suicide to assure his wife's financial security, after he was stripped of his National Health Service pension. Primrose Shipman received a full NHS pension she would not have been entitled to if Harold Shipman had lived past 60 years old. Additionally, there was evidence that Primrose, who had consistently protested Mr. Shipman's innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, had begun to suspect his guilt. Mr. Shipman refused to take part in the courses that would have encouraged acknowledgement of his crimes, leading to the temporary removal of privileges, including the opportunity to telephone his wife, Primrose. During this period, according to Mr. Shipman's cellmate, he received a letter from Primrose begging him to tell me everything, no matter what. A 2005 inquiry found that Mr. Shipman's suicide could not have been predicted or prevented, but that procedures should nonetheless be re-examined. After Mr. Shipman's body was released to the family, it remained in Sheffield for more than a year, despite multiple false reports about his funeral. Mr. Shipman's widow, Primrose, was advised by police against burying her husband in case the grave was attacked. Harold Shipman was eventually cremated on the 19th of March 2005 at Hutcliffe Wood Crematorium. The cremation took place outside normal hours to maintain secrecy and attended only by Primrose and their 4 children. In January 2001, Chris Gregg, a senior West Yorkshire police detective, was selected to lead an investigation into 22 of the West Yorkshire deaths. Following this, the Shipman inquiry submitted in July 2002 concluded that he had killed at least 218 of his patients between 1975 and 1998, during which time Mr. Shipman practiced in Todmorden from 1974 to 1975, and from Hyde from 1977 to 1988. Dame Janet Smith, the judge who submitted the report, admitted that many more deaths of a suspicious nature could not be definitely attributed to Mr. Shipman. Most of Mr. Shipman's victims were elderly women in good health. The judge, Dame Janet Smith's 6th and final report, issued on the 24th of January 2005. Dame Smith reported that she believed that Mr. Shipman had killed 3 patients, and she had serious suspicions about 4 further deaths, including that of a 4-year-old girl during the early stage of Mr. Shipman's medical career at Pontefract General Infirmary. In total, 459 people died while under Mr. Shipman's care between 1971 and 1998, but it is uncertain how many of those were murder victims, as Mr. Shipman was often the only doctor to certify a death. Judge Dame Smith's entire estimate of Mr. Shipman's total victim count over the 27-year period was 250. The GMC charged 6 doctors who signed cremation forms for Mr. Shipman's victims with misconduct, claiming they should have noticed a pattern between Mr. Shipman's home visits and his patients' deaths. All these doctors were found not guilty. In October 2005, a similar hearing was held against 2 doctors who worked at Tameside General Hospital in 1994, who failed to detect that Mr. Shipman had deliberately administered a grossly excessive dose of morphine to a patient. The Shipman inquiry recommended changes to the structure of the GMC. In late 2005, it came to light that Mr. Shipman may have stolen jewellery from his victims. In 1998, police had seized over £10,000 worth of jewellery that they found in Mr. Shipman's garage. In March 2005, when Primrose was asked for its return, police wrote to the families of Mr. Shipman's victims asking them to identify the jewellery. Unidentified items were handed to the Assets Recovery Agency in May. The investigation ended in August. Authorities returned 66 pieces to Primrose and auctioned 33 pieces that she confirmed did not belong to her. Proceeds of the auction went to Tameside Victim Support. The only piece of jewellery returned to a murdered patient's family was a platinum diamond ring, for which the family provided a photograph as proof of ownership. A memorial garden to Mr. Shipman's victims, called the Garden of Tranquility, opened in Hyde Park, Hyde, on the 30th of July 2005. As early as 2009, families of over 200 of the victims of Mr. Shipman were still seeking compensation for the loss of their relatives. In September 2009, letters Mr. Shipman wrote in prison to friends were to be sold at auction, but following complaints from victims' relatives and the media, the sale was withdrawn. The Shipman case and a series of recommendations in the Shipman Inquiry report led to changes to the standard medical procedures in the UK, which is now referred to as the Shipman effect. Many doctors reported changes in their dispensing practices, and reluctance to risk over-prescribing pain medication may have led to under-prescribing. Death certification practices were altered as well. Perhaps the largest change was the movement from single doctor general practices to multiple doctor general practices. This was not a direct recommendation, but rather because the report stated that there was not enough safeguarding and monitoring of doctors' decisions for their patient. The forms needed for cremation in England and Wales have had their questions altered as a direct result of Mr. Shipman's case. As an example, the persons or persons organising the funeral must answer, do you know or suspect that the death of the person who has died was violent or unnatural? Do you consider that there should be any further examination of the remains of the person who has died? Harold and Fred, They Make Ladies Dead, was a cartoon strip in 2001 issue of Viz Comic featuring serial killer Fred West and Harold Shipman. Some relatives of Mr. Shipman's victim voiced anger at the cartoon. Harold Shipman, Dr. Death, an ITV television dramatisation of the case, was broadcast in 2002. It starred James Bolam in the title role. A documentary also titled Harold Shipman, Dr. Death, with new witnesses' testimony about the serial killer, was shown by ITV as part of its Crime and Punishment strand on the 26th of April 2018. The programme was criticised as offering little to no new insight. A play titled Beyond Belief, Scenes from the Shipman Inquiry, written by Dennis Wolfe and directed by Chris Honer, was performed at the Library Theatre in Manchester from the 20th of October to the 22nd of November 2004. The script of the play comprised edited verbatim extracts from the Shipman Inquiry, spoken by actors playing the witnesses and lawyers at the inquiry. This provided a stark narrative that focused more on personal tragedies. A BBC drama documentary entitled Harold Shipman and starring Ian Brooker in the title role was broadcast in April 2014. The satirical artist Cold War Steve regularly features Harold Shipman in his work. The Shipman Files, a very British crime story, a 3-part documentary by Chris Wilson, was broadcast on BBC Two and focused on the victims and how he went undetected for so long. Podcast episode Catching a Killer Doctor from the Cautionary Tales with Tim Harford podcast series featuring the story of Harold Shipman and how it could have been detected much earlier with good statistical models. So what are your thoughts about Mr. Shipman?
Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today we take a look at a man who has been described by some as a muscle-obsessed stalker. This man, it has been alleged, has been harassing young men and boys to feel and measure their muscles since at least the 1980s, and with deadly consequences. Akinwale Arobiki was born on July 15, 1961, at Crumpsall Hospital in Crumpsall, Manchester. His mother, Abisola Arobiki, was a secretarial student and his father is unknown. At the age of only 6 months, he entered the foster care system. He spent time in Barnardo's home in Llandudno in Conwy, but would later move to Liverpool. But this seemingly normal and uneventful early years didn't give a true representation of the monster that was soon to come. In the 1980s, Mr. Arobiki turned his attention to Gary Kelly, a 16-year-old athlete from Birkenhead. He would follow him around and ask to feel his muscles. Eventually, the young man would become so disturbed that he went to the police. The officers already had a picture of Mr. Arobiki ready to be identified, which Gary Kelly promptly did. Mr. Arobiki was served with a harassment order, and he wasn't allowed near the area in which Mr. Kelly and his family lived. But this tale wouldn't end with that. While at a swimming pool with his friends, Mr. Kelly would catch sight of Mr. Arobiki. Terrified, he bolted from his friends, desperate to get away from the man who had been stalking him. He tried to evade the man ducking around the crowds, but Mr. Arobiki had seen him and allegedly started following him. Panicked, Mr. Kelly had attempted to evade him by hiding in New Brighton's railway station, hiding in a stationary train before wandering around the platform waiting for the coast to be clear. When he saw Mr. Arobiki again, he made a bid to escape by crawling under a train, and accidentally touched a live rail. Gary Kelly was electrocuted to death, having only been trying to escape the person he should have been safe from in the first place. He left behind a 3-month pregnant girlfriend. During the sentencing, an additional 12 alleged offences were gathered to lie on file in order to keep track of any patterns that would and did emerge. Mr. Arobiki was convicted of manslaughter. However, this was overturned only a few years later. He argued that there wasn't any law against standing and watching the trains, and no evidence to confirm that he had actually been chasing the teenager down. Mr. Arobiki also complained of the racist overtones in the case from the prosecution and the officers involved, and was given £35,000 in compensation after a Home Office investigation in 1989. Mr. Arobiki would only spend 2.5 years in prison for his manslaughter charge. In the following years, it wouldn't be his only run-in with the law, nor would it be the only time his threats were taken at face value. In March of 1997, an article was run by the Sunday People detailing how warnings had been issued to rugby teams after Mr. Arobiki focused his attentions on some of the players. He was accused of gaining information of players' addresses from a fake press pass. He attacked players' houses, vandalised their cars, and threatened them with violence. One player complained to the club that Mr. Arobiki had lifted him off the ground and actually was doing squats with him on his shoulders. Another claimed that the man had thrown a brick through his window. The police were notified, but he evaded another prison sentence. When she was 13 in the year 2000, Kelly Mullaney lived with her family, including her younger brother. Whilst walking to the park one time, Mr. Arobiki attempted to talk to Mullaney's brother and feel his muscles, and she threatened to call the police on him. But this wasn't to end with just that. 30 minutes later, arriving back to their home, rapid banging at the door startled Kelly Mullaney. When she looked out the window and saw it was Mr. Arobiki, who demanded that she come outside, she refused. He then greeted her with a gun pushed through the mailbox, and the 6-foot 5-inch man screaming, "You're fucking dead, you're dead, you're dead." Petrified, the teenage girl called the police, who arrived with 6 police vehicles. Mr. Arobiki was arrested for threatening to kill, but no traces of a gun were ever found. While he denied any wrongdoings, he acknowledged that his actions could be perceived as threatening, even though he had been approaching them out of want of genuine friendship, or at least so he claimed. He was jailed for 30 months at Warrington Crown Court on August 3rd, 2001, but Miss Mullaney still didn't feel safe. Mr. Arobiki's words still rattling around inside her head. She entered a witness protection program and moved halfway across the country. After Mr. Arobiki was convicted of harassment and threatening to kill Miss Mullaney, Merseyside Police launched an investigation into his behaviour, dubbing it Operation Ice. Over 120 people were interviewed, and a disturbing pattern quickly started to emerge. Mr. Arobiki would wait outside gyms, sports clubs and colleges until finding a suitable target, namely muscular young men. He would approach them and ask to feel their muscles or watch them squat, and he wouldn't leave until they would let him do so. Mr. Arobiki even carried a tape measure around to measure the calves, thighs and chests of his victims. When he had his sights set on a particular boy, he would grow obsessive and start showing up wherever they were, learning private details of their lives and their families. A family entered into a witness protection program after Mr. Arobiki wouldn't leave their son alone. and when the police searched Mr. Arabiki's home, they found numerous pictures of muscular men and the personal details of over a dozen victims, including phone numbers and their body measurements. The investigation would end with Mr. Arabiki pleading guilty to 15 separate counts of harassment and witness intimidation. An astonishing 61 counts of harassment were also alleged, but weren't pursued during the case. 31 restraining orders were granted by the judge to protect the young men and witnesses that had been named during the case. On December 15, 2003, Mr. Arabiki was jailed for 6 years. His reign of terror didn't end there either now he was in prison. Multiple inmates came forward to say that Mr. Arabiki had demanded to measure their biceps with a shoelace, but the man denied the accusations were true, saying that they were baseless. No matter how unfounded these accusations were, Mr. Arabiki was moved 14 times because of them. Following the release of Mr. Arabiki from prison in 2006, the Merseyside police appealed for an interim sexual offences prevention order against him, and it was considered unusual as he had never been convicted of a sex offence, and denied getting sexual gratification from touching muscles, but it was still granted due to the cases that had been ordered to lie on file. Under the Sexual Offences Prevention Order, he was not allowed to feel people's muscles, ask them to do exercises in public, or approach any young person under the age of 18. It also banned him from St Helens, Warrington, and Widnes without the permission of either the Chief Constable of Merseyside or the Chief Constable of Cheshire. He was also banned from loitering around or entering gyms and sports clubs. The SOPO order was originally meant to be temporary, but it was made permanent by Judge Bruce Macmillan in 2007. His reasoning was that it was clear that his touching of boys and young men is motivated by a sexual urge. Mr. Arabiki admitted that he had an unhealthy obsession with muscles and the potential of young men to improve their physique, but still denied that it was sexual. No matter what his intentions were, the SOPO order strictly forbade any contact with minors or asking men to feel their muscles. It quickly became apparent that this was outside of what Mr. Arabiki could or would be willing to do. On May 25, 2007, Mr. Arabiki breached the SOPO order by approaching a young man and touching his bicep after travelling to Preston, Lancashire, and he was jailed for a further 15 months. Later in the summer of 2008, Mr. Arabiki would be back in court as he tried to appeal the Sexual Offences Protection Order, claiming that he had been through counselling that had helped him realise what he was doing, and he apologised to the victims, saying that if I am towering over them and I am a big black man, they may not really be consenting, they may be consenting out of fear. Despite the claims, he still showed erratic and unstable behaviour during the court proceedings, and the judge upheld the SOPO order. The second confirmed breach of the SOPO order was in April of 2009, not long after the SOPO order had actually been upheld by the court. Arabiki accosted a frightened 17-year-old boy in Birkenhead, trying to feel his biceps. He was jailed for 18 months, and it was his 72nd confirmed offence. Another 2.5 years were slapped onto Arabiki after he breached the SOPO order again by touching the muscles of a 16-year-old boy in Llandudno, North Wales. Mr. Arabiki defended himself in court, arguing that it was all a hoax. The police received several calls a day saying that I am in locations across the country, even when I'm in prison. Unswayed, the judge found him guilty. In August of 2013, Mr. Arabiki started to win his court cases. He was cleared of all charges relating to his breaking of his SOPO order after defending himself, claiming that it was nothing more than a modern-day witch hunt. He was partly able to prove his point because of the mishandling of the case on the part of the officers, who, desperate to prove his guilt, had approached an alleged victim before the 16-year-old had been ready to come forward. The police also continuously referred to him as Purple Aki. The nickname itself is inherently racist. The purple is derived from people saying he is so black he's practically purple. And this misconduct on the part of the police force became a foreboding cloud that only weakened their case against Mr. Arabiki. Another case in October of 2013 collapsed when it surfaced that the officer involved had been provoking Mr. Arabiki and made other questionable conduct decisions. And Mr. Arabiki wasn't charged. However, he had been forced to spend up to close to 2 years on remand awaiting charges that would inevitably be dropped, or that he was acquitted from. Mr. Arabiki was inevitably charged with breaking his SOPO order once again on the 1st of October 2015. Calling himself Andy, he had met a student on a train and asked to feel and measure his biceps. The student wouldn't realise who he had been talking to until a month later when he read an article on Mr. Arabiki. Despite claiming that it was a setup by the police, he was convicted by a unanimous jury decision. Eventually, Mr. Arabiki would have his sexual offences protection order lifted. In May 2016 at Manchester Crown Court, Judge Richard Mansell said that there was no justifiable proof that Arabiki obtained sexual gratification from feeling his victim's muscles, and that order restrictions could no longer be justified. Now, the name Purple Aki has become an urban legend in the UK underworld. Parody accounts of him can be found across all social media. There's an Instagram page dedicated to him wanting to legalise cannabis, and a Twitter profile with his face photoshopped onto a naked muscular man. Most of the fear that once surrounded him has faded away, and to many he's nothing more than a local boogeyman. But the question still remains, is this an act of taking a predator's power away, or is it laced with racism overtones that will do more damage than good?
Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content.
Reaching the peak of his power in the 1950s, Arthur Thompson was a gangster who established a criminal empire in Glasgow City. From working as a strong-arm enforcer himself, to rising in the ranks and becoming a godfather making £100,000 a week, today we take an in-depth look into the life of the last godfather. Glasgow's chronic overcrowding and rampant poverty, made worse by the Great Depression, fed into the city's growing underworld, creating the perfect environment for gangs and crime to spring up. Arthur Thompson was born to a normal, law-abiding family in September of 1931. His father worked as a steel worker, and his early years were filled with petty fistfighting, then with open razors and petty thievery, before escalating. Mr. Thompson started his criminal career with the racketeering of local shops. At first he was just an enforcer, a strong arm to convince people to pay, working for local loan sharks and then eventually the Crays in London. He would mention to shop owners that if they wanted their windows intact by the morning that they should pay him. Those that wouldn't pay would find themselves sweeping up broken glass, or worse, crucified to the floor or their front door. His wife, Rita Thompson, would work as a singer at some clubs, being paid hefty sums for her talent. However, they weren't paying her for her services, and she wasn't a singer. It was simply a means to pay Thompson without arousing suspicion. Gradually, he would begin loan sharking on his own, using the methodic and ruthless tactics he'd learned from the Crays to place himself at the top of the pile in Glasgow. Mr. Thompson quickly graduated to safe blowing, the preferred method of robbing banks at the time. Many shops and banks hadn't upgraded to the state-of-the-art safes that had relocking mechanisms, making them vulnerable to brute force and strategically placed bombs. Mr. Thompson was clumsy on a particularly sloppy robbery, and the police hunted him down and his associates. He would only spend a few years in prison though compared to the others, a pattern that would repeat itself numerous times throughout his 30-year criminal career. Along with bank heists, money lending and protection rackets with local shops, Mr. Thompson started investing his money in legitimate businesses. He had always seen himself as a businessman, and he put in the work to make this true. This worked to keep money flowing in and to hide the income he was getting through illegal means. He owned scrapyards, dance halls and pubs, gradually accumulating enough money and status to be one of the most powerful men in Glasgow. He bought a manor that was nicknamed the Ponderosa after the television show Bonanza, a popular 1970s series. It was rumoured by some that by the end of his life, he was making somewhere close to £100,000 a week from his combined incomes. On the 22nd of August 1966, Mr. Thompson was dosed with his own medicine. A car bomb had been placed under his car, and it erupted after he and his mother-in-law had entered the car. Mr. Thompson was very luckily able to walk away with minimal injuries, but his mother-in-law, Maggie Johnston, wasn't as lucky, and she unfortunately passed away later. The blame was placed on Patrick Welsh and James Goldie. Mr. Thompson had been feuding with the Welsh family for a while up until this point, but justice was swift in the eyes of Mr. Thompson. Not long after the death of his mother-in-law, an unidentified car pushed Welsh and Goldie's car right into a lamppost, killing both of them on impact. Arthur was quickly detained as a possible suspect, as it seemed obvious that this was a revenge killing, and his eye-catching Jaguar matched the description of the perpetrator's car. With the police hunting for evidence, Mr. Thompson found himself in the unique position of being in two court cases at once. In the case of his car bombing, he was a witness, and he was a suspect in the case of Patrick Welsh and James Goldie's murders. He refused to work with police to find who had killed his mother-in-law. His hatred of law enforcement ran that deep. On the other case, he and his people intimidated almost all of the witnesses into silence, threatening to bomb houses if they tried to speak against Mr. Thompson. Eventually, the case around the bombing was dropped due to lack of evidence, leaving Thompson's lawyers still defending him on the case of the 2 other murders. Soon the jury would come back with a shocking verdict: not proven. Without any evidence that Arthur Thompson was actually behind the wheel of the car that killed Welsh and Goldie, and no witnesses, they were forced to let him walk free. The violence in the Thompson family didn't rest solely with Arthur either. His wife, Rita, spent 3 years in prison for stabbing Patrick Welsh's wife numerous times, a final act of revenge for killing her mother. While crime ran deep in the Thompson family, not all of the children inherited Arthur and Rita's tenacity when it came to illegal activities. Arthur Thompson Jr. was proving not to be the most clever either, and the large shoes that he had to fill left by Arthur Sr. were proving to be too much for him. With the waning influence of Arthur Sr., his son, nicknamed Fat Boy, had to make his own way in life, while still keeping the Thompson family name alive. He did so by tapping into the then exploding heroin epidemic in Glasgow, but was met with numerous blunders. One of his most notorious rumoured incidences involved him buying £30,000 worth of liquid heroin in a glass bottle, only to discover that he'd been scammed into buying water. Instead of leaving with what was left of his dignity, Arthur Jr. doubled down on the drug dealing. His clumsiness landed him 11 years in prison for dealing heroin. It wasn't as if Arthur Jr. was wasting away in prison though. His father had pulled some strings and used his prison contacts to ensure his son was well taken care of and had luxuries such as steak, alcohol and chocolate. During this time, Mr. Thompson Sr. hadn't slipped into a quiet retirement either. He was still an extremely powerful criminal, which made him a target for assassination attempts. He survived at least 3 major attempts, including the car bombing that killed his mother-in-law. A hitman hired from Ireland by a rival of Mr. Thompson walked up to him and pulled the trigger. However, the gun misfired, and in the shootout that followed, Thompson would only be shot in the groin rather than between the eyes. He drove himself to the hospital and refused to tell police anything, adamantly stating that it had been the result of a construction project gone wrong. The 3rd assassination attempt was a hit and run, in which he only broke his leg. He was otherwise alright and refused to aid the police in finding the culprit, but his troubles didn't stop with the attempts on his own life. After being given 48 hours leave from prison to prepare for his impending release, Arthur Jr. was publicly putting together a hit list of people that he perceived to have done wrong to him and led to his time in jail. Drunk one time, he loudly announced his plans to the people near him, drawing unwanted attention. But because he was in one of his father's establishments, the Proven Mill Inn, he saw himself as safe. He wasn't. Later that night, when walking the short distance between his house and the Ponderosa, 3 men jumped Mr. Thompson Jr. and he was shot 3 times. 1 shot grazed his cheek, the 2nd punctured a lung, and the 3rd was deliberately fired into his anus. He died bleeding out in front of his father's home, where Mr. Thompson Sr. would find him. And Arthur Thompson Jr. wouldn't be the only tragedy to befall the Thompson family. Margaret Thompson, Sr.'s daughter, would die from a drug overdose in 1989, and his other son, Billy, would also die due to complications from drug addiction in 2017. Both were heroin users, and the exact drug that Arthur Jr. had been building his empire on. Thompson Sr.'s 2nd daughter, Tracy Thompson, lives in secrecy of who her family really was in fear of revenge attacks, as do Thompson Sr.'s grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Paul Ferris, a one-time accomplice of Arthur Jr., was charged with the murder and remanded to HM Prison Barlinnie, and 2 of his associates were implicated in the murder as well. It seemed logical that Mr. Ferris had been close to the Thompson family for a long time, some sources even saying that Arthur Thompson Sr. saw him as another son. He had worked as an enforcer and been able to get close to the younger Arthur as well, before he left the family and started his own gang. It would make sense that some hostilities had been held over that, especially for a man who had a history of crucifying those who wronged him. What would follow after the murder of Arthur Thompson Jr. was the longest and most expensive trial that Scotland had seen. The trial lasted a total of 54 days and cost over £4.1 million. Along with Mr. Thompson Sr., over 300 witnesses were called to the stand. During the investigation, Strathclyde police raided the Ponderosa, but couldn't find anything to incriminate Thompson Sr. The man had been in the game too long and to be dumb enough to leave evidence of his illegal business dealings around his home. Paul Ferris pled not guilty, saying that a hitman had been brought from Ireland to eliminate the young kingpin. In the end, Paul Ferris was found not guilty on all charges and released from prison in 1992. Either as a present for the grieving father, or an attempt to get into his good graces, the bodies of Ferris's friends, Robert Glover and Joe Hanlon, were found dead inside a car on the funeral procession route. They had been shot in the back of their heads, execution style, and had been shot in their anuses, an act of final revenge for the way that they had killed Arthur Thompson Jr. Rumours spun around that Mr. Thompson had paid over £20,000 for a hitman to take the two out, as he believed them to have been a part of the murder of his son, Mr. Thompson Jr. But it wasn't the only event that would happen at the funeral, because when they reached the cemetery, a bomb scare would also rattle the nerves of all the funeral attendees. In the end, it was an innocuous heart attack that killed Arthur Thompson Sr., the godfather of Glasgow. He died at the age of 61 on the 13th of March 1993, only a year after the conclusion of the court case at Glasgow Royal Infirmary. With him went the remnants of a golden age in organised crime in Glasgow, as the empire he had spent decades building quietly faded away. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Street Crime UK. In today's video, we're going to take a look at Mr. Bartley Gorman, the undisputed gypsy fighting king. So, just how did this seemingly normal travel man from Nottingham, England, go on to be labelled the king of the gypsies? Well, in this video, we're going to break it down and have a look. But as always, if you enjoy UK crime content, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and use the notification bell if you never want to miss an upload from us again. So let's begin, shall we? Gypsies and travellers are people who live a nomadic lifestyle and consider travel to be an important part of their ethnic or cultural identity. The Irish Travellers are an ethnic group in Ireland with their customs, language and traditions. Many people spend all or part of their year in the United Kingdom. One of the things that are a custom in the travelling community is bare-knuckle boxing. The original form of boxing, bare-knuckle boxing, is closely related to ancient combat sports. It involves two people fighting without the use of boxing gloves or other hand protection. The difference between street fighting and bare-knuckle boxing is that the latter has a set of established rules, such as not striking a downed opponent. The London prize ring rules were the rules that governed bare-knuckle boxing for much of the 18th and 19th centuries. With the American promotion, Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship, bare-knuckle boxing has seen a resurgence in the 21st century. Modern bare-knuckle boxing is only practiced on a small scale around the world. Among the competitions are bare-knuckle boxing and ultimate bare-knuckle boxing, otherwise known as BK/BTM in the United Kingdom, Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship BKFC in the United States, and Top Dog Fighting Championship in Russia, Top Dog FC. There are a few differences between traditional glove boxing rules and modern bouts. Any knockdown triggers an 18-second countdown. The 18 count is used only in BK/BTM, whereas the traditional 10 count is used in BKFC. One man who lived for bare-knuckle boxing was Bartley Gorman, who was born on the 1st of March 1944 to English parents Samuel and Katie Gorman, who did not like fighting at all. Bartley supposedly had his first bare-knuckle fight at the age of 12, which is hard to believe given modern day standards. Well, this is according to press reports anyway. In certain respects, he thought he was the natural heir to his great-grandfather Boxing Bartley, Ireland's King of the Tinkers in the 19th century, and his grandfather Bulldog Bartley, another undefeated bare-knuckle boxer, so he felt a lot of pressure growing up. In the realm of illegitimate gypsy fighting, he reigned supreme from 1972 to 1992. He was the undisputed king of bare-knuckle boxing. He fought in a mineshaft, a dump, horse fairs, campsites, bars and parties, and on the street throughout these years, and even challenging infamous London brawlers Lenny McLean and Roy Shaw. Nathan Gorman, Hughie Fury, and Tyson Fury are the 3 of Bentley Gorman's relatives who have gone on to become professional boxers in recent years, with Tyson Fury having a 24-0 record. I think it's safe to say he inherited a lot of the strong fighting genes from his family. Bare-knuckle fighting was regarded as a legal and acceptable practice by gypsies. As well as a means of expression, young gypsy boys dream of becoming the champion boxer of their patch of territory. Just like young boys are today aspire of being David Beckham or other celebrities, these young boys wanted to be the best boxer of their patch. Bartley Gorman was 28 years old, 6'1" and weighed 15.5 stones, when he captured the title of bare-knuckle champion of Great Britain and Ireland after defeating the competitor Jack Fletcher in a contest at an abandoned quarry. According to reports online, this was a brutal and bloody fight. However, things weren't always easy for Bartley. He was nearly murdered by an armed crowd at St. Leger's Day in 1976. He had arrived preparing to face Ricky Top Hat Donahue, but was instead attacked by the gang, who had allegedly been paying £25,000 to carry out the assault. It's unknown who exactly ordered the attack, but it was likely someone trying to make a name for themselves in the gypsy community. In his novel, Bartley explains, "I arrived at the agreed upon time of 10:30 AM, but he, Mr. Donahue, was nowhere to be found, and it was strangely quiet, and almost out of nowhere 25 plus men with crowbars and bricks emerged. I was thrashed mercilessly. I was knocked unconscious and don't remember much about it." After David Pierce KO'd former WBA World Heavyweight Champion John Tate in California, Bartley Gorman and David Pierce agreed to compete for the World Unlicensed Championship. "Dave Pierce is Britain's best gorger fighting guy, and I am the king of the gypsies," Gorman said. "If I win, I'll challenge Muhammad Ali to a contest for the crown." This was made possible by their friendship with Paddy Monaghan, and a former bare-knuckle boxer and Ali's mate. If Pierce participated, the BBC threatened him with a worldwide ban. Pierce was pressured to decline and was saddened as a result, feeling like he let his legacy down. Muhammad Ali, who was nicknamed the Greatest, is widely regarded as one of the most significant and celebrated sporting figures of the 20th century, and he was one of Bartley Gorman's heroes, and he based much of his fighting technique and skills on this. He dreamed of one day challenging Muhammad for the World Championship. It seemed that Bartley Gorman had never lost a fight until he announced his retirement from boxing after getting a draw with Graham O'Loughlin Kennedy. Gorman died on a traveller site in Uttoxeter, England on the 18th of January 2002, where he had spent his final days. For Uttoxeter, he was more of a town wonder, where they honoured him by inscribing his name on their Millennium Monument alongside such illustrious Staffordshire greats as Joseph Bamford, the founder of JCB. So this shows that he was pretty well revered and well known. Not only was he a well known and revered person in his own culture, but his fame had spread far and wide, catching the attention of even his hero, Muhammad Ali, who knew exactly who Bartley Gorman was, and even somewhat admired his heart and his fighting spirit. It is reported that the pair even met and practiced sparring together, with Muhammad Ali saying that Gorman had a great technique. During a 2014 interview, actor Tom Hardy said that Bartley Gorman's voice was an influence for Bane's accent in the 2012 film The Dark Knight Rises. According to rumour, Bartley Gorman is credited with helping to inspire professional wrestler Wade Barrett's bullhammer elbow finisher, which is known simply as the bullhammer, which further serves to demonstrate the spectacular amount of recognition his fame and reputation have survived over the years. Gorman's 210-page autobiography, King of the Gypsies, was completed just before his death in 2001 with the help of Peter Walsh. Gorman tells an unflinching but moving story about a man driven to fight and suffer by the weight of his violent family history. According to the book, he was only 9 years old when he first witnessed the horrors of violence. Bartley witnessed his uncle being killed by a rogue showman's single punch. Something like that must have gone on and messed him up really badly over his years. Tales of brutal fights at fairs, racetracks and bars take up a large portion of the book, as you would expect, so it's worth a read if you get the chance, and it's available to download on Amazon. Peter Walsh, who knew Bartley for the last 18 months of his life, summarises him as follows. He was a one-of-a-kind individual. He was a lovely man with a wicked sense of humour, but a perpetual sense of melancholy. And when you look up the meaning of the word melancholy, it says a feeling of pensive sadness, typically with no obvious cause. which is pretty heartbreaking to think that that's how he felt at the end of his life after achieving so much within the travelling community. In 1995, Shane Meadows, an English director and screenwriter, filmed a short documentary called King of the Gypsies. To be honest, it's an outstanding documentary. The film gives an honest and humble insight into the life of undefeated world champion bare-knuckle boxer Bartley Gorman. A true legend in which he interviewed Gorman about his life. Some poor quality clips are available on YouTube if you want to check them out for yourself, although the picture quality is not great, but you do get to hear Bartley's distinctive voice. So guys, that was the brief and somewhat sad story of the life and career of Bartley Gorman. Let us know in the comments section below what you think about this gypsy fighting king. To us, he seemed like an interesting character that lived his life on his own terms. Also, let us know if there are any other UK true crime cases that you would like to see us cover here on the channel. Please don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content. As always, stay safe. Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today, we're going to listen to the story of a man of many names. Michael Peterson transformed into the man he is today through decades of crime, isolation and violence. But how did a failed robber turn into the most dangerous prisoner in the UK? And how did a man rack up a total of 22 years in solitary confinement? Before he was Charles Bronson, he was Michael Peterson. Michael Peterson was born into the respectable and law-abiding family of Ira and Joe Peterson. The middle of three boys, his mother describes him as a kind and affectionate child, and he lived a normal childhood. He dabbled in petty theft with his friends, stealing things like shoe polish before being apprehended and reprimanded in juvenile detention. Peterson ended up leaving school at age 15, turning straight to the workforce. He went to live with his grandmother where he worked labour jobs, and on a night out, he met the woman who would soon become his first wife, Irene Kesley. After a few months, she discovered she was pregnant and the two married. With the marriage came a sigh of relief from Peterson's parents. They hoped that with his new family, Peterson would settle down, and it seemed like this was the case for a few years until he started drinking and staying out late again, sometimes days at a time. When questioned by his wife, he claimed to be sleeping off his hangovers. In actuality, he was planning the armed robbery that would end with his first of many prison visits. At age 22, Peterson robbed a jewellery store with three other men. The men all beelined for the safe, however most of the money laid in the jewellery that was on display, and they made off with scant amounts of money. The police quickly found them, and while the amount that was stolen wasn't much, Peterson had been carrying a loaded gun, and he was sentenced to 7 years in jail with the promise of being out in 3 for good behaviour. It was quickly realised that good behaviour wasn't something that Peterson was going to keep up with. After 6 months of maintaining his sanity, it all became too much for Peterson. He started attacking everything and anything around him, destroying a prison workshop, attacking another inmate. His actions led to beatings and extended stays in solitary confinement, and extra months tacked onto his sentence due to excessive violence, such as when he attacked another inmate with a glass jug. He was given an additional 9 months for that incident alone. His wife Irene divorced him. She served the papers to Peterson after one of the many beatings from prison guards. It would be 23 years before Peterson would see his son after the divorce. Peterson was transferred numerous times and from prison to prison due to his volatility, and met violent career criminals like the Cray twins, whom he befriended. He was disconcerted by the number of dangerous and psychotic inmates around him, such as John White, a child molester and murderer, whom Peterson ended up strangling to death at Broadmoor. A broken tie saved another man from a similar fate. He was the first inmate in almost 100 years to reach Broadmoor's roof, staging a protest against the conditions he lived in and the forced medication. The environment mixed with the concoction of drugs, including the sedative antipsychotic Largactil, made Peterson extremely ill and turned him into a different person, according to his family. They said that there were times his letters to them were so muddled that they couldn't even understand him, and he faced horrific side effects such as paralysis, lockjaw and muscle seizures. Peterson reached Broadmoor's roof 3 separate times, doing upwards of £250,000 worth of damages to the hospital. During 2 of the protests, he had to be talked down by his visiting family, who were heartbroken at seeing him that way. He also staged an 18-day hunger strike after his third rooftop protest, which resulted in his transfer to a different hospital. To cope with the forced medication, Peterson took up art and fitness, both of which he greatly excelled at. His cartoons portrayed his everyday life and the little scenes he had created for himself, such as befriending the family of rats in his cell. The name of his style of art matched himself, outsider art, meaning it wasn't influenced at all by the greater art world and society. His fitness regime was intense, and it bulked up his already impressive stature. When he left the ward for what should have been the last time, a guard said, "See you soon," knowing he wasn't ready for the outside world at the time. He finished his first sentence in 1987. After leaving prison, Michael Peterson stayed with his parents in Aberystwyth for only a few days before leaving for London, complaining that the city was just too small for him. Searching for ways to make ends meet, Peterson followed the advice of friend Reggie Cray to take up bare-knuckle boxing in illegal underground rings. It was here that Michael Peterson became known as Charles Bronson, named in honour of the actor with the same name. Funnily enough, he claims to have never seen a Charles Bronson film. He was moderately successful, mostly known for his brutality, but the prize money didn't last, and he returned to his old habit to pay the bills. Going back into robbery, at one time he made off with around £1,000 in jewellery. It didn't take long for the police to find him though, partly because of the bulk he had put on in jail. Bronson would spend 69 days out of prison before he was apprehended by the police for robbing the jewellery shop. During his sentencing, multiple prisons denied him, as he had proven himself to be volatile and uncontrollable, and he was placed in a maximum security unit. His new sentence was 7 years. The patterns from before emerged again, and he fought with prisoners and prison officers. He started riots, destroyed prison property, and even held a deputy governor hostage. This behaviour was met with beatings and long periods of time in isolation. Bronson was moved from prison to prison, sometimes spending as little as a month in one prison at a time. This constant shifting of location made treating him and his anger issues nearly impossible. Most psychiatrists refused to work with him, and the ones that did manage to start treatment with him only had a short amount of time. And this led to a much larger question. Was prison truly there to rehabilitate Charles Bronson, or was it there to merely contain him? At one of the prisons, they relaxed some of his restrictions, and they saw improvement. A guard who worked with Bronson called him polite, and he didn't start as many fights. But any progress this may have led to was dashed when he was moved once again and forced back into solitary confinement. Jim Dawkins, a security guard who worked with Bronson, said it was always one step forward before the prison system forced him back 2 steps. No matter what the answer to this question, Charles Bronson was dangerous, and when left to his own devices, he just wouldn't change. He spent long stints in isolation for numerous offences, including punching an inmate and running around Long Lartin prison in a nude during a riot. He was released from prison, this time for a mere 53 days. In an interview, his mother said that her son was traumatised from his stay in prison, partly due to an attack that led him to being stabbed in the back several times. The attack left him unable to stand people walking behind him, but left without any way to reform himself, Bronson was arrested again. The charges of conspiracy to rob were dropped this time, but in February of 1993, he was arrested for conspiracy to rob yet again and possession of a shotgun. While out of prison on bail for the newest charges, Bronson snapped, and in Wood Hill he kidnapped a librarian and held them hostage. Whilst negotiation with the police was going on, he demanded an inflatable doll and a helicopter and a cup of tea. He was captured and the trial continued, arguing that the shotgun was to commit suicide. He was just charged with possession and was given 8 years in prison. When he was transferred to Wakefield, he immediately spent 40 days in the isolation ward, in the nude. The conditions pressed him closer to another mental break, and in 1994 he took a deputy governor hostage on Easter Monday, continuing to add to his notoriety. And notorious Bronson was. With the help of his constant moving, his reputation had travelled quickly, and more than a few correctional officers had tried to take a shot at Britain's most violent inmate. He was beaten with batons, had fingers broken, and he was kicked in the testicles repeatedly, and he had his moustache ripped out. This only cemented what Bronson already knew. Violence was the only way to get what you want in this world. At Belmarsh prison, another hostage situation played out. After 2 Iraqi phone hijackers bumped into him, he kept them captured for 7 hours, along with another prisoner. He openly admitted that he was losing it badly, which was showcased in forcing the two Iraqi men to tickle his toes and call him general. Eventually, he willingly released the hostages and went back to his cell in the isolation unit. He was given an extra 5 years on his sentence for the hostage situation. In 1998, Charles Bronson attempted to reach out to his son that he had with Irene Kesley. 23 years ago is a long time to go without speaking to any kid, so with the help of a childhood friend, he was able to track down his son, Michael, and have him visit. The two immediately bonded, and when it was time for Michael to leave, he told his father, "I'll keep out of trouble if you can keep out of trouble." His father agreed, and for a while he did behave himself, but he had yet to go through the ordeal that would give him his life sentence. In January of 1999, Phil Danielson was working as an educator in prison. Rumour reached Bronson that Danielson had been slagging off his artwork. Showing his now famous temper, Bronson took the man hostage in an ordeal that would last for 44 hours. Danielson made it out safely, but was traumatised, and later said that the time was drawn out because Bronson wanted to surpass a previous record. During the ordeal, he also destroyed upwards of $500,000 of property, throwing around furniture, refrigeration units, and even a washing machine. Up until this point, Bronson had evaded a life sentence, and he hoped to continue this. He defended himself by arguing that the prison system had turned him into what he was, so he shouldn't be held accountable. How would you feel waking up in the morning with a window? "I'm not living, I'm existing." This defense didn't work. The judge deemed him mentally fit to stand trial, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Danielson, his victim, did not return to his job educating criminals due to PTSD. This slice sentence didn't stop Bronson from maintaining relationships with women. Since first entering prison, the list of girlfriends and fiancées ran long, including 3 total wives and at least 2 girlfriends. He had a daughter with Fatima Sayara Rahman, who he married in 2001. In honour of her religion of Islam, he changed his name to Charles Ali Ahmed. Despite claiming that his wife and daughter were helping him rehabilitate, they ended up separating only 4 years later. His third wife was Paula Williamson, an actress. They were married in the prison chapel in November of 2017. Despite following the same trajectory as his previous relationships and divorce being on the horizon, she passed away in 2019 before the divorce could be finalised. In total, Bronson had held over a dozen people hostage and racked up nearly £1 million in damage to the prison property. Collectively, he spent over 22 years in solitary confinement, where he continues to create art and work on his fitness. In honour of Salvador Dali, he changed his name to Charles Salvador, which is the title that he used for setting up the Charles Salvador Art Foundation, which promotes his artwork and encourages the participation of inmates in art. He has written and published 11 books and won 11 Koestler Trust Awards. Funds from the auctioning of his artwork have gone to his mother, who is still alive today and heartbroken over her son, and also to charities that help children with cerebral palsy. His appeals on his sentencing have been soundly rejected many times. No matter how much of Charles Bronson's behaviour was a product of the prison system or his own nature, years of solitude and lack of psychological help created a violently murderous man that truly deserves the title of the UK's most dangerous and notorious criminal. Thank you all for watching, and if you enjoyed, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more UK true crime content.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content.
Today we take a look at one of the most dangerous criminal families to ever exist in the UK criminal underworld, especially in the Everton area. A family that became so notorious that police were forced to create a specialist team in order to try and take back control of the streets in which the gang had taken over. The G family were a very notorious crime family that grew up on the dangerous Grisdale estate, which can be found in Everton. Darren and Daniel G were very well known on the estate and part of the larger family, which included their other siblings Billy, Ian and Stephen G. In particular, out of all the brothers, Daniel and Darren G had both become involved in very serious crime at an early age. The brothers made it clear that they wanted to make their mark in the Grisdale estate. In many previous interviews, Darren has explained how the brothers had nothing but a poor experience in the education system, and because of this bad experience, he had been left with no choice but to leave school at the age of 13. By the time the brothers were young adults, Darren explained that most of the G family did not have the necessary qualifications or skills that were required to get a decent job, especially one that would support them on the estate. Just a few miles to the north of the city centre, Everton's Grisdale estate had been turned into an extremely dangerous drugs market by the brothers in a quest to make money and gain control. The brothers and their extensive criminal activities left the police with no choice but to task an independent team with the job of taking down the G organisation. Ordinary families who wanted no part in crime had no choice but to look the other way as crimes were committed on a daily basis. And once the G family realised that the local residents had lost all faith in police, it only got worse. The brothers now terrorised anyone who stood in their way, on their conquest to turn the residential estate of Grisdale into an area that was exempt from the rule of law. The Grisdale estate was home and stomping grounds for the G brothers. The crime family enjoyed their status as gang leaders, and it's mostly agreed that the crime gang that polluted Grisdale was led by Darren and Daniel G, who both had no trouble using extreme violence and intimidation tactics to dominate the backstreets and alleyways in the North Liverpool estate. The brothers were always associated with very serious violence and had also made a lot of money drug dealing. The leading members of the G family understood the game and became employers as well as enforcers to people who resided on the estate. The G brothers had surrounded themselves with many people that they had grown up with and knew they could trust. The brothers and their criminal gang had reportedly used the profits that they had made from selling drugs in the local community to buy more loyalty, protection and better security. It was also reported that the G brothers paid children to be on the street corner rather than go to school. These young foot soldiers were paid large sums of money to give more incentive to be willing to participate in the criminal activities of the gang. The brothers created an extensive criminal network in and around Grisdale estate, one that became so big that many reported it was a common sight to see mums and dads selling drugs around the clock. The worst thing about this was mums and dads would have the kids with them as they tried to sell as much crack and heroin as they possibly could. At the brothers' height in the drugs game, it was reported that the Gs were earning at a very minimum around £20,000 a week from their extensive criminal activities in and around Everton. The police and the local residents all knew that the brothers were running a 24-hour Class A drugs business, and one that was based in the heart of the Grisdale estate. The brothers and their gang would go on to operate around-the-clock drug sales with pay-as-you-go mobile phones being used to take orders, then dispatching outriders on mountain bikes to deliver the product to the customer. Younger kids, who were not yet ready in the eyes of the gang for handling the drugs and large amounts of cash, would instead be offered a chance to be employed for £50 a week to act as lookouts to spot police and rival gang members. It must have been unimaginably difficult for locals who just wanted to live a law-abiding lifestyle and did not want any involvement in the G's criminal enterprises. They, in essence, all had become outsiders on their own estate, and the locals were forced to confront the many inherent risks and dangers of living next to some of the country's most dangerous criminals. A survey conducted on behalf of the police had shown that the fear of violence being committed stood at 80% among the law-abiding community on the Grisdale estate. As well as their ability to inflict extreme violence without hesitation, it has also been suggested that the G family had also been able to flourish in such a way because of a peculiar situation that allowed them to thrive in the Grisdale estate. Many people describe the Grisdale estate as a place that's removed from the rest of the world. Many presumed that there was another much more organised and higher powered criminal organisation behind the G crime family. This theory was especially believed by the police and detectives, who were working in the G case. To them it seemed the brothers appeared to be the public front of what was a very violent and extremely sadistic regime. It was clear that the Gs appeared to relish that notoriety that the criminal exploits had earned them, amongst the local community especially, and they liked to be in the thick of the action whenever it occurred. Tit-for-tat shootings became commonplace around the estate, and it was made very clear that nobody was allowed to stand in the way of the brothers' profitable money-making rackets. In 2003, there were simmering tensions between the G brothers and a rival faction of drug dealers who were also in operation in the area. But by 2004, the fallout had resulted in a wave of shootouts across the north of Liverpool. On the first day of January 2004, there was a double shooting in the Royal Oak pub in West Derby. One man died from the shooting and another was left fighting for his life. Relations between another local drug boss named William Moore and the G's criminal family had deteriorated at a rapid rate. On the evening of the 6th of April 2004, the G's returned to the Grisdale estate after attending a funeral in Speke. The brothers and the two friends were driving along Robson Street when Darren's younger brother spotted a suspicious car on the street. They stopped the car and reversed to see who was inside. However, upon doing so, they were met by former SAS officer Darren Waterhouse. Mr. Waterhouse was a hitman, and he was hired by the opposing crime boss to take out the rival gang or any of its members. Upon seeing his intended target, Mr. Waterhouse began shooting. He riddled the Ford Galaxy with bullets. However, the intended target, Darren, had just switched seats with his friend Craig Barker, who was only 18 at the time. And to make matters worse, the group was driving a new car they had just brought recently. As this car was a different model to the Galaxy they were used to driving, the group was still getting used to using the new clutch. And as the shooting began, in a rush to escape the shootout, the car was stalled and unfortunately Mr. Barker was left in point blank range of the gunfire. He was consequently hit with many bullets from the hitman. After the shooting had taken place and upon realising that he had shot the wrong target, Mr. Waterhouse made his exit. Darren tried to take Mr. Barker to hospital in the car that had just been shot up, but a bullet had been lodged into the gearbox of the car, and because of this, the car was now stuck in second gear. Unable to drive the car above second gear, Darren pulled the car over and stopped another car passing by. The woman who was driving the car pulled over but was met by Darren covered in blood screaming at her to open the car door. She was so scared that she refused to let him in. Darren had no choice but to smash the car window and steal the car so that he could rush his friend to the hospital. But unfortunately, Mr. Barker died of his injuries. Ian G, who was driving the vehicle at the time, suffered life-changing injuries. Mark Richardson, another associate of the G's, suffered a minor wound and managed to escape. Darren G, according to intelligence, was thought to have been Mr. Waterhouse's intended target for the shooting, but after unknowingly changing seats with his friend, was very luckily not hurt. Darren recounts that the whole incident is something that will never leave his thoughts, as his best friend Mr. Barker was fatally shot in a case of mistaken identity right in front of him. He even recounted that the bullets were clearly meant for him, as they immediately stopped shooting once they realised they had hit the wrong person. The gunman, Mr. Waterhouse, used to serve with the Coldstream Guards, and was honoured for his highly commendable actions by way of a military cross, and also presented with a Radar People of the Year award. Darren Waterhouse was convicted in 2005 for the murder of Craig Barker and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Darren has always professed his innocence to the crime and still does to this day. The courts found Mr. Waterhouse guilty of being involved in the shooting of Craig Barker. Mr. Waterhouse had admitted he had associates from that area, associates that he had met whilst in prison previously while serving time on a drugs charge. For one reason and another, Mr. Waterhouse became involved in the drug culture, having left the army. While serving his prison sentence, he met his co-defendant, William Moore. Mr. Waterhouse and Mr. Moore became very good friends, and had even associated outside of the prison environment. William had a brother called John, who had explained to Mr. Waterhouse that there appeared to be some discontent with a notorious family that was competing for control of the drugs market, the G's in Liverpool. On the night Mr. Barker was killed, Mr. Waterhouse had agreed to attend Liverpool to see William. He travelled up in his own car, using his own mobile phone to keep in contact with William and taking his dog with him. The prosecution alleges that Mr. Waterhouse attended Liverpool as a contract killer, and that Darren G was the intended victim, not Craig. The shooting occurred on Robson Street on the Grisdale estate in Everton on April 6, 2004. Craig was in a car with three of his friends, Darren G, Ian G and Mark Richardson. The driver of the car was usually Darren G, the one whom Mr. Moores was having trouble with. Darren G has just got in the back of the car as he was playing with a new computer game that he had just installed, so Craig was now the driver. The group were driving around the Everton area when a man jumped out of a car and opened fire on the Galaxy they were sitting in. Shots were fired all over the car in what was described as an uncontrolled manner. Craig was shot several times as he scrambled around in the car in an attempt to escape. Two passengers received no injuries, and one, Ian G, received injuries to his leg and thigh. The gunman left the scene in his car, which was later discovered burnt out. The police attended the scene and all parties refused to cooperate with the police. Later that evening, Craig died from his injuries. Later on, further statements were obtained from the other occupants of the car. Darren G had described the gunman as having red or ginger hair and looking like a male wearing an alpine hat. Mr. Waterhouse was arrested in Luton at his home address. Whilst at the police station, Mr. Waterhouse was asked to cooperate in an identification parade, to which he consented. The identification suite was new at Luton police station, and Mr. Waterhouse had been arrested with no clothing on his upper body. It was a hot summer's day at the time, and the police ID suite at the time did not have any clothing to offer Mr. Waterhouse to wear, but the officer investigating the crime had a spare t-shirt that he had brought to work with him that day. The t-shirt was taken to and worn by Mr. Waterhouse on the ID parade. It was a video parade. The t-shirt was navy coloured, and the other volunteers in the parade were specifically selected around this, as well as a few with navy coloured t-shirts to blend in with the t-shirt Mr. Waterhouse had been given to wear. By the time the video had made its way up to Liverpool, the volunteers had been changed by the inspector as he found them not to be suitable, and the volunteers who were wearing a navy t-shirt had now been removed. The video was thereafter shown to 3 occupants of the car, who had now changed their minds and decided to cooperate with the police about the shooting. Ian picked out Mr. Waterhouse from the video parade, albeit in his statement he said, "I didn't see him fire or what was firing because I ducked down straight away, and I can only recall both were white males, and that's it really. I don't recall any clothing, ages or sizes, it all happened too fast and my head was down in my lap area." The others did not make an identification. An anonymous witness who stood approximately 12 feet from the junction phoned the police and gave a description of the gunman as wearing a balaclava hat cricket style and coveralls and gloves on. Mr. Waterhouse was charged with the murder, along with William and John Moore. During the trial, it emerged that Craig's mother had given the police a list of several names that she believed were responsible for killing her son, and all the names on this list have since been shot and killed. There was also another male who was ginger-haired from the area, and someone who had a fractured relationship with the G's. This same male had secured his alibi, as he was in an off-license around the time of the shooting, where his girlfriend worked, and he secured the CCTV footage from the shop and lodged it with his solicitors before he had even been arrested or questioned. Mr. Waterhouse suggested to the court that that is slightly strange behaviour for someone who has nothing to do with the crime. Mr. Waterhouse accepted that he was in Liverpool that night, but on the basis that he was not there to shoot or kill anyone. During his trial, an ex-soldier who served with Mr. Waterhouse attended the trial to give character references. The ex-soldier was now a serving police officer and stated to the court that Mr. Waterhouse was an expert in using firearms. In his personal opinion, an uncontrolled shooting of this nature was not in Mr. Waterhouse's style, or in fact, for that matter, how the pair had been trained to shoot by the special forces. All military personnel had been taught to execute a double tap when shooting to kill in the army. A double tap is when 2 shots are fired to the chest and 2 shots are fired to the head, and the ex-soldier wanted to make clear that the courts, in a way without sounding like boasting too much, that Mr. Waterhouse was way too much of a professional and had too much expertise to shoot in such a haphazard way. However, regardless of this statement, Darren Waterhouse and William Moore were both convicted by the jury and sentenced to serve 30 years in prison each. The CPS proceeded to have another trial with William's brother John Moore, who then decided to change his plea to guilty on the basis that he knew harm was going to be caused to an individual, but not harm which would result in death. Some years after the conviction, Mr. Waterhouse claims Darren G sent him a Christmas card, and inside the card was allegedly a note from Darren stating that his brother had been able to pick Mr. Waterhouse out on the ID parade as the police had told him what t-shirt Mr. Waterhouse was wearing in the picture. A statement was taken from Darren G by the solicitor representing Mr. Waterhouse regarding this incident. Mr. Waterhouse also claims that during the disclosure of the trial, the CPS refused to disclose the 999 call that was made during the shooting. The judge said it did not assist the defence or undermine the prosecution case enough to be used in court. It was alleged that Mark Richardson had phoned 999 when the car was under attack, and within this recording there are specific questions that the operator asks, especially in particular to descriptions of suspects that are attacking. Based on this new evidence, an application was made to the Court of Appeal, the COA, on behalf of Mr. Waterhouse, who considered that this new evidence from Darren G should be enough evidence to warrant a retrial. However, the Court of Appeal dismissed the application, stating that Darren G was not a credible witness and could not be believed. An argument was presented by John Cooper, QC, acting on behalf of Mr. Waterhouse, that the 999 call that was made during the attack was highly relevant in light of this new indication for an appeal. The Courts of Appeal refused to see any reference under the new evidence and did not agree the 999 calls that were made under extreme duress should be disclosed. Darren Waterhouse argues that if the 999 call does not undermine the prosecution or assist the defence, then why is it that this recording has not been disclosed? The solicitors who work for Mr. Waterhouse stated that in most cases the 999 transcripts are served, especially during such a high profile trial. Darren Waterhouse is adamant the 999 tape recording will prove his innocence. Mr. Waterhouse believes this is a complete miscarriage of justice. His defence is that he is a highly trained soldier who, according to the prosecution's case, could not carry out a contract killing on the right victim, used his own car and phone, and had to spray a car with 9 bullets from 3 feet away. The very same man was awarded the Military Cross for bravery and leadership and served 14 years, most of which he was an instructor in weapons tactics. He also served on covert ops for the SAS. The prosecution suggested that Mr. Waterhouse received money for the killing, but stated there was no evidence that funds had ever come from William Moore. Mr. Waterhouse explained that he did have money around him at the time, but that was from cultivating cannabis. The police said that the crop he was currently growing when arrested had not come to fruition, and served an account statement from the electricity company which showed money had been put on the electricity meter from November 17, 2003 to January 22, 2004 in the sum of £210. After the court case, his defence team managed to obtain a full electricity statement which showed that £1,650 worth of electricity had been used from July 2004 and a full crop of cannabis had been grown by this stage, contrary to what the police/prosecution suggested. However, regardless of Darren Waterhouse's complaints, he remains in jail to this day for the contract murder of Craig Barker. In 2005, William Moore, who was 45 at the time, and Darren Waterhouse, who was 39 at the time, were both jailed for life for the Craig Barker murder after a trial at Liverpool Crown Court. The 2004 summer shooting was the explosive climax of a North Liverpool drugs war that rocked the area. David Regan, who was 36 at the time, was blasted 3 times in the back and legs at the car wash that he owned on Prescott Road, Old Swan on May 18, 2004. Mr. Regan was thought to have been shot after he was wrongly blamed for the murder of Craig Barker, and also what Darren G believed was in fact an attempt on his own life, one that had gone wrong during a North Liverpool drug war. Darren said he plotted the murder after being wrongly told that Mr. Regan was behind the attack on him. Darren also explains that when he was given this information about Mr. Regan, he was not in the right frame of mind and that those around him did not pull him to the side and tell him to think about what he was doing, but instead encouraged him to take revenge. Darren G was arrested for the crime and admitted to his part in the murder and was placed on remand to await sentencing. Darren was originally facing a recommended minimum of 35 years under the current sentencing guidelines, as his legal team seen his crime as borderline contract killing. Whilst on remand and awaiting sentence, Darren had accepted in his mind that a sentence of 30 to 35 years was on the horizon, and he had prepared himself mentally to spend the rest of his life in jail. However, on the day of sentencing, something that nobody was expecting happened. When Darren appeared before the court for sentencing, the judge told him that as his crimes were committed pre-2004, Mr. G would now be sentenced under the old law. And because of this, it now gave the judge 2 choices. A discretionary life sentence if the judge felt Darren would continue to be violent or had a history of violence which was increasing. A sentence where he would not be released until parole approved him being released. Or a fixed long-term determinate sentence. This could be imposed if the judge felt Darren could in fact change if given a second chance to start his life, where he would be given a release date. The judge looked at Darren's criminal record, and upon seeing there was only one previous charge of violence, this was for threatening to blow up a prison officer's car, but as this threat was never actually carried out, the judge ultimately decided to give Darren another chance, and so Darren G was sentenced to 18 years in prison after being found guilty of conspiracy to murder at Manchester Crown Court in 2006. During Darren G's years in prison, he has described how he has seen and was many times part of more criminal activities, and has even told the story of how he was caught having a sexual relationship with a nurse whilst incarcerated. Darren G claims a nurse who was working at the prison, Jane Jackson, was caught topless in a private treating room with himself at HMP Woodhill in Milton Keynes. The Category A prison, which was dubbed Britain's Alcatraz, houses some of the country's most dangerous criminals, including rapists, murderers and terrorists. Miss Jackson had jammed a mop under the door of the treatment room and stripped off in front of the inmate Mr. G. The Nursing and Midwifery Council panel had ruled that a nurse had in fact had an inappropriate and highly sexually motivated relationship with a prisoner whilst at work. Miss Jackson's fitness to practice was found to be impaired because of the misconduct she had taken part in, and she was struck off because of the incident. Paul Morris, who was chairing the hearing, said, "It was quite clear that Miss Jackson had not provided a high standard of practice at all times whilst working, and had acted without any integrity or had respect to uphold the reputation of the profession, especially of those who work with vulnerable people. The hearing found that Miss Jackson had failed to establish and maintain professional boundaries with the prisoner that she was meant to be providing care for, and also found that Miss Jackson was in breach of her obligations as a nurse, which when mounted together amounted to Miss Jackson taking part in very serious professional misconduct. Her flagrant disregard of policy seriously undermines the risk of security, and not only to herself and colleagues who she works with, but the security of the entire prison and its population. Her misconduct carried an unwarranted amount of risk of harm, and brought the whole medical profession, especially those who work within the prison system, into major disrepute. It was reported that Miss Jackson was caught out on February 7, 2009, when a prison guard, Rebecca Langley, had burst into the treatment room during her fling with Mr. G. Her top half was naked as she was holding her bra and staff tunic in her hand, said Barry Dooley for the NMC. A sobbing Miss Jackson was taken straight to the prison governor's office and suspended for her actions before being marched off the premises. Miss Jackson admitted to breaking strict regulations by being alone with a prisoner, and also further breaking the regulations by taking off her clothes. But Miss Jackson had claimed it was a one-off, and she said that she had been pressured into the act by the inmate, and only committed the misconduct as she was fearing for her life. Miss Jackson told how Mr. G had said, "Let me into the treatment room," and he's had this horrible look on his face. She said, "I just froze and panicked and then very stupidly opened the door." She added during the hearing that she opened the door like a robot, adding that the prisoner had the remote control of my body. "At least that's how I felt." HMP Wood Hill is one of the country's maximum security prisons, housing inmates that have committed some of the most serious crimes. But Mr. Dooley, who was in charge of overseeing the hearing, stated, "If Miss Jackson was so scared and feared for her life in the way she described, then why would she open a locked door and go in with a prisoner simply based on just a scary look? She did not call out for help at any stage, although she knew that there were prison officers nearby. She even admitted to another member of staff she had put the mop across the door for extra privacy." Miss Jackson had previously said to another officer that she had strong feelings for the prisoner. "I knew deep down that I was a professional and he was a prisoner." It was also suggested that Miss Jackson just threw her keys to the prison doors on a chair during her time with the prisoner, putting the entire security of the jail at risk, the hearing was told. "Being in a confined space with a prisoner means that you have potentially put at risk the entire establishment," said Hannah Pugliese, a senior manager with Milton Keynes Primary Care Trust, which provides medical care at the jail. "You could have been held hostage, you could be at very serious risk, especially in that particular environment," she says. Miss Jackson had already confessed to breaching strict security by smuggling a Lynx deodorant and Radox shower gel into the jail for the prisoner in January 2009. "Very stupidly I brought toiletries in just to shut him up," Miss Jackson said. "I knew it was absolutely wrong, but I still did it." The contraband items were found in his cell following Miss Jackson's suspension, adding weight to the NMC's case that Miss Jackson had not just had a momentary fling with a random prisoner, but that it was in fact much more serious and a sexual relationship with one particular prisoner. Mr. G worked in the prison laundry along the corridor from Miss Jackson's office, and would regularly chat to the nurse on his way back to the cells. Miss Jackson also denied that the 2 drug cabinets that were located in her treatment room were left open during her encounter with the prisoner, a claim that was later rejected by the panel. Miss Jackson was fired by the Health Trust on July 9, 2009, following a lengthy and in-depth internal investigation. After serving his time, and now in his 40s, Darren G was released from prison. Darren had mentioned in interviews and to the newspapers that he organised Mr. Reagan's murder because he wrongly believed that he was involved in the murder of his best friend, Craig Barker. Darren said that he felt guilty over the deaths of Mr. Reagan and Craig Barker. He said that his friend Craig was not involved in any serious crimes and that he died that day because of his casual association with the G's. Darren also explains that he has tried to reach out to the families of those who have been affected with his actions, but it seems unsurprisingly that not everyone is ready to forgive and forget everything that has happened. Nikki Reagan, who spoke on behalf of the Reagan family, had this to say: "The murder of David Reagan in 2004 destroyed our family. We were left isolated and vulnerable. So-called friends disappeared, but that's what happens when a loved one is shot dead." There was a long and complicated court process which led up to the conviction of Darren G. We were subject to threats and intimidation throughout the trial. The Reagan family has struggled to forgive Darren G for the role that he played in organising David's cold-blooded murder. But we do not want or seek revenge. We are painfully aware that nothing good can ever come from acts of revenge or violence. It only ruins more lives. Our message is that the Reagan family wishes to be left alone, and especially left alone by Darren G. He will know what we mean by that. He is active on social media and often posts content which we object to. He appears to hold a grudge of sorts against our family, and we objected to seeing him boasting about chopping heads off on television and on the internet. Surely this was not necessary. After Darren G left prison, he was released into a different world, and has explained how at times he felt so depressed and angry that he himself would have very bad thoughts of taking his own life. But one time whilst having these bad thoughts, he saw a campaign for choose a life and not a knife, and said the message hit him hard. It was at this point Darren decided to focus all his energy into something completely different. He decided that he would devote his time to help others not make the same mistake in life that he had made. From that point on, Darren became a prolific anti-knife campaigner, and has spoken of his regret he has felt, especially over the years of his life that he wasted on gangland violence. Darren joined the knife crime charity, the Ben Kinsella Trust, which educates young people on the dangers of knife crime, and helps them to make positive choices in life to stay safe. The Trust also campaigns for the action and justice of those who are already affected by knife crime, and their campaigns have won numerous awards in recognition of their success. The Ben Kinsella Trust is a trust which campaigns for change, challenging government, businesses and society to ensure everyone takes responsibility for tackling knife crime. However, now becoming a social media sensation and maybe not realising that he was under the watch and scrutiny of millions of people who were touched by his experience, Darren G was removed from the charity after threatening to destroy a podcast host in an online bust-up. The charity had been alerted to inappropriate language used in a public forum and explained that this conduct was contrary to their values and ethics. The charity referenced several articles that were published online, which reported Darren G threatening James English, who hosts the podcast Anything Goes. Darren and Mr. English began to clash in a public disagreement, which saw the pair claiming each other had been used by the other to gain publicity online after Darren had appeared on Anything Goes 3 times for interviews. It had also been reported that Mr. G was uncomfortable with the later appearance of Marvin Herbert on the podcast. Mr. G has also reportedly said himself that he declined to appear on Anything Goes alongside a prison guard. At the time of the bust-up, Mr. G had posted a series of posts on Instagram saying he's a rat, referring to James English. I classed him as a friend for a very long time. You've tried to stab me in the back and this isn't a game, you effing ballbag. He also posted that he elevated Mr. English's podcast to a whole new level by suggesting that he helped Mr. English secure 100,000 subscribers in a few months. Mr. English responded by removing all 3 podcast episodes he had conducted with the ex-gangster from his platforms, and said he would not be re-uploading them until he received an apology. In 2008, Liverpool Crown Court was told how Jamie Starkey fired at Danny G after claiming his family suffered months of violence and death threats. Danny G, it was said, cruised around the Grisdale estate in a chauffeur-driven £60,000 Range Rover, whilst children he had recruited to work for him delivered drugs on bikes to the local addicts. Lawyers for Mr. Starkey alleged Danny G's gang had thrown bricks at the Starkey's home, rammed his brother's car off the road, and repeatedly threatened his relatives in their day-to-day lives. On one occasion, criminal associates of Danny G and his gang were said to have smashed every window at Mr. Starkey's home, covering his 4-year-old sister in glass and leaving his family in even more fear. Days before the shooting of Danny G took place, it's claimed Danny had kidnapped one of Mr. Starkey's friends and imprisoned him in a derelict house, where a gang had beaten and stoned him for his friendship to Mr. Starkey. On New Year's Eve, Mr. Starkey had been out celebrating in Everton with friends, when he encountered one of Danny G's criminal associates, who threatened to shoot him. The youngster fled the scene to a nearby derelict property on his road. It was here that Mr. Starkey received a Colt revolver that was hidden inside. During a 15-minute confrontation outside a pub at 5 AM the following morning, witnesses heard Danny G threatening Mr. Starkey's family and goading Mr. Starkey to shoot him. At one point, Danny G told Mr. Starkey, "Shoot me now or I'm going to go and kill your mother." Mr. Starkey felt he was left with no other choice as a way to protect his family and fired. One of the bullets went into Danny G's stomach, which pierced his lung and went straight out of his back. He was taken to the hospital but refused treatment. 4 days later, Danny G was arrested for masterminding a city centre drugs conspiracy and was subsequently jailed for 7.5 years for his part in the drugs plot in June 2008. Mr. Starkey was also jailed in October 2008 after he admitted wounding Mr. G with intent and possessing a firearm with intent to endanger life. It emerged following the shooting Danny G had sent a text message to Mr. Starkey offering not to speak to police in exchange for £20,000. But it was also revealed to the courts that Mr. G was plotting revenge on Mr. Starkey within hours of being injured. When a policeman went to speak to Danny G about his injuries, Mr. G said, "I fell over, mate," and then winked at the officer, but added, "Don't worry though, I'll get the little C word that did this to me." Mr. G then made a call to Mr. Starkey's mobile just hours after returning home from the hospital after being shot. Danny G is alleged to have said, "All be ready, cause one of yours is gonna get killed. We're not going to go in there, you stupid little tools. You haven't got a clue. We're going to go to one of your girls' mas or anything first. You little wankers, they're going to go first." Also adding, "We're going to deal with every one of them until we get all of you." Police, who by that time had bugged his plush flat in an attempt to trap him over his drug deals, had also managed to obtain recorded phone calls which showed Danny G conspiring to buy guns and threatening to kill Mr. Starkey. Police officers and detectives working the case overheard Mr. G plotting revenge against Mr. Starkey and referring to a .45 and a MAC-10 machine gun. In a conversation with his partner, Danny G was overheard saying, "Don't worry, the little fucker is going. The only place he is safe is in jail, and he won't be safe there. It'll be even worse in there. Then when he is out, I'll slit his fucking throat." The next day he is alleged to have said on the phone, "Pit me in for 12 guns, I'll buy the lot of them." And in another conversation the court heard, "We're going lad, we're going big time, right through the front door, right through the back door, and bring this family down. Kids, whatever, it's all fine lad, see you soon lad." In 2010, Danny G was found guilty of 2 counts of threats to kill and another of 2 of blackmail, and he was told to serve a minimum of 4.5 years, which was to run concurrently with the term that he was already serving for drug dealing. Danny G's barrister, Stuart Lawson Rogers QC, told Liverpool Crown Court that his client had only conspired to arm himself because he feared another confrontation with the Starkey family. QC Rogers claimed that Mr. G had been targeted by the police because of his Underworld family name and revealed to the court that his client's greatest fear was receiving an indefinite sentence, an IPP, because Mr. G believed he would never be released from prison again. Judge Henry Globe QC told the courts, "I am in absolutely no doubt that the public must be protected from you, now and in the future." He also said, "In my opinion, I really do not know when it will be safe to release you to the public again." He ordered the very well built and extremely intimidating Danny G to serve a minimum of 4 years behind bars before his case can go before the parole board. But he also said the sentence will run at the same time as the 7.5 year sentence he is currently serving for drug offences. Mr. G's partner, Kelly Wallace, had wept in the public gallery as Mr. G was led down. Danny G was found guilty of 2 counts of threats to kill and another 2 of blackmail at a trial. But jurors were unable to agree on the 2 more serious charges of conspiracy to murder and the conspiracy to possess a firearm and ammunition. Jamie Starkey was only 16 when he shot and wounded Daniel G at a point-blank range during a 5 AM New Year's Day standoff outside a pub. He served 3.5 years out of a 7-term sentence before being released in September 2011. Shortly after being released from prison and telling officers that he feared for his life, upon release from prison at around 8 PM on Sunday night, Mr. Starkey was walking to his car outside his home in Fazakerley in Liverpool when a hitman dressed in dark clothing approached Mr. Starkey and cut him down in a hail of bullets. The hitman ran off across the playing field, leaving Mr. Starkey to die. Merseyside police went to interview Danny G in jail, where he's serving an intermediate prison term, or IPP, for threatening to kill Mr. Starkey in a revenge attack. Chief Superintendent John Ward of Merseyside Police said this was a cold-blooded, calculated shooting of a 21-year-old man who had recently been released from prison after shooting another male on New Year's Day 2008. There is no doubt that this was a targeted shooting, and whoever did this meant to kill Jamie Starkey. We believe that some members of the criminal fraternity will know who did this, and will know what lies behind it, and I would appeal to them to contact us. Jamie Starkey was just 21 years old, and should have been looking forward to his future, but he chose a path which ultimately led to his death. 5 men were arrested in connection to the murder, but to this day the crime is still unsolved. Merseyside Police said it is committed to tackling gun crime and taking offenders off the street, and can reassure residents that they are doing everything in their power to find those responsible for this shooting. Danny G, it has been reported, was known as someone who cannot control his anger, not even half as much as Darren. Many ex-prison officers on YouTube who have worked in prisons that he was locked up in have compared him to Charlie Bronson. Both Charlie and Danny are known for their physical strength, but also being trapped in a system with no sight of being released anytime soon. Many even believe that the prison service created Danny G and have moulded him into the new notorious prisoner to take Bronson's place after his numerous prison stunts and experience in the prison system since a young lad. Many stories that have given to us recently about Danny G are from his brother Darren, or have been recounted by Neil Samworth, who served as a Manchester prison guard for 11 years, and has now left the prison service and decided to tell his story online in podcasts. Mr. Samworth describes Danny G as someone who has little to no respect for the prison guards, who are tasked with a job of looking after him whilst being locked up. Danny was described as standing about 6'2", with having a thick neck and thick wrists, and was known to be extremely powerful. He was categorised as a 1%er in the prison system. This is someone that has brought and can reignite at any time huge problems to the entire prison and its population. Mr. Samworth explained that Danny G was a prisoner who was always in the segregation unit or place that is otherwise known as a solitary confinement. Recalling one particular incident when Danny G had smashed his cell up, it triggered 10 officers to get all padded up and try to confront him about his behaviour. However, Danny was in a very violent mood and single-handedly beat up each one of them as they entered the room to confront him. Mr. Samworth explains how Danny G pulled helmets off the officers' heads, pushed them down and even dealt many of them vicious blows. Following this incident, Danny G was moved to a special cell, one that was stripped bare with nothing except a wooden bucket that was to be used as a toilet. In April 2014, a hitman gunned down a member of the G family, Ian G, in the middle of a residential street in a drive-by shooting. Ian G was found lying in a pool of blood by a passing paramedic response car. Ian had been shot twice in the leg on a previous occasion when he was in the car during an attempt on his brother Darren's life. However, it's also believed that Ian survived this attack and went on to be a very close associate of Danny and Darren G in their drug business. William G, better known as Billy, was found unresponsive at his parents' home on Maryport Close, Everton, on February 19, 2016. Billy was last seen alive at 1 AM that morning after leaving a pub where he had been drinking with his mum. Billy, who was only 38, had a medical history of epilepsy, drug overdoses and alcohol abuse. It was reported that he had taken cocaine and 6 bottles of Copperberg cider before he died. Stephen G in 2017 reportedly targeted a 77-year-old victim and burgled him. Stephen G was arrested after an incident in Cotsbrook Road, Norris Green, on the evening of Friday, July 7, 2017. Mr. G admitted to robbing the elderly man's car keys and car in court. It was revealed by the court that Stephen G's past convictions include violence, assault, public disorder, theft and criminal damage and robbery. In another later incident, Mr. G was handed a 2-year antisocial behaviour order, banning him from entering parts of North Liverpool in July 2009. Just weeks after being given the ASBO order, Mr. G carried out 2 more burglaries, for which he was jailed by a judge for 33 months in February 2010. It was reported that this time Stephen G took advantage of the 2 women while they were distracted working in the shops by stealing their purses. After the second raid, he was chased by police and jumped from a flyover, but was tracked down by the police force's helicopter. Desmond Lennon, defending in court, said Stephen G had been homeless and desperate at the time and suffered from acute dyslexia. Stephen G was released on licence, but then went on to run and was returned to jail in June 2011 after stealing from a car. Darren G has come home from spending 12 years in jail to a completely different world and no family support, but has quickly adapted to the new world and become a social media sensation. After spending such a substantial amount of time locked up in prison conditions and having to endure the experiences that he grew up with, it will inevitably take him a while to readjust fully to society and his freedom. However, regardless of personal opinions about Darren, he has, no matter what has been thrown at him, remained focused on spreading his message of choose a life, not a knife, and CrimeUK UK. With all the life experience that Darren has gained, be it inside or outside the UK criminal justice system, along with his self-described and very traumatic upbringing, Darren G is now in a position where he is now fortunately equipped with more than enough knowledge and life experience to educate and share wisdom with those who might be headed down a wrong path or thinking of making a bad or wrong life-changing decision. In his journey to change his own mindset, whilst also being in the process of trying to help others change and become more positive to make the right choices in life, we wish him the best of luck. The G family, the crimes they committed, and the reputation that they earned will never be forgotten about in the UK criminal underworld.
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.
Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Today we will be covering UK criminals who have been found guilty of committing a serious crime and have been sent to jail. While serving time, criminals insist they are innocent and have written out to the public to share their stories. Firstly, we look at William Gage. So, who is William Gage? Mr. Gage was jailed for life and ordered to serve a minimum of 20 years in prison. Mr. Gage has always protested his innocence and lost his two previous appeals to overturn his conviction for murder. Both were rejected at the Court of Appeal in Edinburgh and Glasgow, Scotland. Mr. Gage, 40, was found guilty of shooting 30-year-old Justin McElroy 6 times as he returned to his family home in Cambuslang in March 2002. Mr. McElroy was shot repeatedly as he returned home with his pregnant wife, Tracy. Mr. Gage's trial heard the businessman was murdered outside his home in Cambuslang, Acacia Way. The court was told that Mr. McElroy had been leading a double life and had a conviction for a drug offence. While Mr. McElroy appeared to be working in his family business, he was also said to be mixing with drug dealers and heavily involved in the heroin trade. Undercover police were said to have been keeping a watch on Mr. McElroy for 3 years prior to his murder. Mr. McElroy's murder was supposed to have been ordered because he owed a drug debt of approximately £50,000. Mr. Gage's appeal sought to convince 5 judges at the Court of Criminal Appeal in Edinburgh that Mr. Gage did not get a fair trial and was the victim of mistaken identity. Mr. Gage also challenged claims that a burnt-out Saab car, which prosecutors said was a getaway vehicle, was used in the shooting. Mr. Gage also claimed that there were substantial inconsistencies in evidence about the clothing which was said to link him to the shooting by traces of DNA and firearm discharge residue. Gunshot residue, also known as cartridge discharge residue, gunfire residue, or firearm discharge residue, is residue deposited on the hands and clothes of someone who discharges a firearm. It is principally composed of burnt and unburnt particles from the explosive primer, the propellant and possibly fragments of the bullet, cartridge case and the firearm. A graphic representation of the GSR left on a target when fired upon varying ranges. Law enforcement investigators test the clothing and skin of people for gunshot residue to determine if they were near a gun when it was discharged. Gunshot residue can travel over 3 to 5 feet from the gun. At its furthest distance, only a few trace particles may be present. Judge Lord Hamilton, sitting with Lords Reed, Carloway, Mackay and Nimmo Smith, rejected Mr. Gage's appeal. Their written ruling stated, related criticisms can undoubtedly be made of the evidence in each of these strands, but when the evidence is looked at as a whole, the case against the appellant was, in our view, compelling. The Lords added that they were not persuaded the trial against Mr. Gage was actually unfair. Mr. Gage went on to protest his innocence against the court's ruling. The decision concluded, in all circumstances, this appeal must be refused. After telling Mr. Gage his appeal had been rejected, there were shouts heard from the public gallery. "The fight goes on," and "keep your head up." Speaking outside the court, Mr. Gage's solicitor, Jim Keegan, said, "For 8 years, William Gage has protested his innocence, and we will continue to do so. He is deeply disappointed by the decision. Once we have an opportunity to read the judgment, we will consider whether to seek appeal to the Supreme Court." William Gage, 34 at the time, was jailed for life for shooting of 28-year-old Justin McElroy in Cambuslang in 2002. Appeal judges in Edinburgh had told Mr. Gage in advance his appeal would be refused. They were due to give a final decision, but were halted by an outburst from Mr. Gage, who said he had not had a fair hearing and his lawyer had simply let him down. After Mr. Gage sacked his lawyer, Mr. Keegan, Judge Lord Hamilton agreed to give him 2 weeks to find a new representative. Claiming to have been misrepresented, Mr. Gage said, "As far as I am concerned, I have not had my appeal, as my solicitor was obviously working for the other side." Mr. Gage had failed to explain when asked why he had not raised this concern before. Lord Hamilton said the court had completed its written judgment and ordinarily the appeal would be refused. Lord Hamilton added, "In view of the unusual circumstances of this case, the court is prepared to afford you a short period of time with a view to getting additional legal advice." The judge warned Mr. Gage that any written evidence should be logged well in advance of the 9th of February. Mr. Gage from Hillhead in Glasgow was convicted of killing a millionaire's son who was returning home to his pregnant wife. Widow Tracy McElroy later told a trial that she would always remember the staring eyes of the hooded assassin who shot her husband 5 times as Mr. McElroy stepped out of his Mercedes. Mr. Gage has continued to protest his innocence since he was jailed for the high-profile shooting in March 2002, claiming he was the victim of mistaken identity. Mr. Gage's campaigns for freedom has attracted a number of supporters in and around Glasgow. Mr. Gage claimed that the trial heard evidence which cast doubt on the certainty of Mrs. McElroy's identification. Solicitor Jim Keegan, who represented Mr. Gage before being sacked, told an earlier appeal hearing the Crown case was peppered with inconsistencies. Trial Judge Lord Emsley, describing the jury's guilty verdict in his report to the appeal court, said, "What is clear, however, is that there were exceptional difficulties to overcome if such a verdict was to be reached." Lord Hamilton gave Mr. Gage a further 2 weeks to talk to his new lawyer. After a brief hearing in Edinburgh, Solicitor Amar Anwar said he would be taking on the case. "It is unfortunate that we claim to have the best justice system in the world, yet innocent men like William Gage continue to be incarcerated," Mr. Anwar said. The original murder trial in Glasgow heard that Mr. McElroy was murdered over a £50,000 drug debt. After the fatal shooting, it was revealed that the businessman had been living a double life. Mr. McElroy was said to have been dealing heroin, and a detective from the Scottish Drug Enforcement Agency told a trial that Mr. McElroy had been a target for surveillance for 3 years. Just days before his death, Mr. McElroy was approached by a mystery man who warned him to pay the money that he owed. Hours after a visit to Perth prison to see 2 inmates, Mr. McElroy was gunned down as he stepped from his car outside his home in Acacia Way. Mr. Gage's new representation, Mr. Anwar, told appeal judges that while the jury was trying to make up their minds, they had asked to see phone records and a diary kept by a girlfriend who backed up Mr. Gage's alibi. But the court also heard that DNA tests linked clothing to Mr. Gage. They had been found in a partly burned white Saab in Easterhouse, thought to be the getaway car. The cagoule and trousers also revealed traces of firearm discharge residue. Lord Hamilton said that the Court of Criminal Appeal intended to reject the arguments put forward on behalf of Mr. Gage, but would not finally decide the appeal. Now we move to the letter sent directly from Mr. Gage himself. It was recently announced that William Gage's appeal against the conviction of murder had been denied. This judgment is a travesty of justice, which relies on circumstantial evidence. It is inconceivable that the evidence, the burden of proof led at the trial, can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Gage has any involvement with the shooting of Justin McElroy. There is no direct evidence that connects Mr. Gage with the shooting at Acacia Way in Cambuslang. They are keeping a man locked up in what can only be described as a spurious innuendo, and not facts that should be used in a court of law. To continue to maintain that a white car found in Easterhouse is linked to William Gage via a DNA sample found on particles of the clothing in the boot of the car. There were also 2 other unidentified DNA samples found on the clothing in the car as well. They allege that 8 particles of firearm discharge residue was found on particles of the clothing. This shows that the white car was involved with a gun crime, and there's no reporting of a gun crime involving a white car, then this shows that this car must be tied to the shooting of Justin McElroy. More importantly, there are a number of problems with this argument. First, the appeal court accepts that the FDR was a common type and similar to the FDR found at the scene of the crime. Similar means that it is not the same, therefore the 8 particles did not come from the gun that shot Justin McElroy. The worst part of the appeal court and Crown's argument is the fact that they maintain that 8 particles prove a gun crime. This is an absurd assumption, as one shot would release thousands of particles, never mind 5 shots that killed Justin McElroy. According to Dr. John Lloyd, former House Office forensic scientist, said, "When a gun is fired, the gun leaves behind thousands and thousands of mini particles. But only 6 were found on the jacket, 3 on the surface and 3 particles in the pocket. It is more likely that the lack of FDR shows it has come from cross-contamination. Even in the likes of the USA, a number of states will not allow the use of FDR as evidence, as it is highly contaminable. Therefore, there is no proof that this jacket was worn when a gun was fired, and certainly no proof to link it with the gun that killed Justin McElroy." Mr. Gage's fight for justice goes on. The quality of evidence presented at trial, and now propped up by the Scottish Appeal Court, it is a disgrace and should enrage any intellectually honest person. This case will be going to the Supreme Court and if necessary to the European Court of Human Rights. This is a travesty of justice, that in the 21st century a man wither in a Scottish prison serving a life sentence that is purely circumstantial, and rather than be interested, Lord Hamilton makes a mockery of justice. Lord Hamilton should hang his head in shame. Messages of support and solidarity can be sent to Mr. Gage. His postal address is in the description below. So what are your thoughts about Mr. Gage's story and letter to the public? Do you believe he is innocent of his crimes? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today's video is slightly different to our normal content, as today's case takes place hundreds of years ago. It's been over 200 years since the last execution in Pembrokeshire. In 1821, at Haverford West Castle, murderer William Roblin had been hanged after murdering a former employee, William Davis, after a drunken dispute over unpaid wages. So who was William Roblin? William Roblin has achieved a rather infamous reputation, especially within the Welsh area in which he lived, after being the last person to be executed in Pembrokeshire. However, Mr. Roblin's tale is one filled with uncertainty. Having been the talk of the town for so long, fabrications surrounding his name have been very popular. Though this is what we do know about this controversial figure. William Roblin was born in 1776 in Burton, Pembrokeshire, Wales, to a poor farmer called Richard Roblin. However, in his adult life, Mr. Roblin struggled to settle down into a single job due to suffering from a crippling drinking problem. Eventually, Mr. Roblin was able to get by running an inn at his Deep Lake farm. It was there he also oversaw an alehouse known as Homebound. Homebound has been described as a veritable vortex sucking in vicious tales of murder and debauchery. Mr. Roblin had been previously linked with several other crimes before shooting his former employee. An Irish hawker had visited his Homebound and was never seen again. William Roblin was later accused of secretly murdering the Irishman, and had also been previously linked with the body of an unknown woman found within the orchard of his Deep Lake farm. Mr. Roblin was described by locals as having a fiery temper with a psychopathic rage. William Roblin was born in the rural idyll of Martltwy in 1776 in Pembrokeshire, Wales. Pembrokeshire is a county in the southwest of Wales known for its coastal landscapes and excessive agricultural significance. Even today, 86% of Pembrokeshire land is focused on oil, agriculture and tourism. Within Mr. Roblin's own hometown, there is no known record of his baptism. Mr. Roblin was often accused of hating religions by locals. This alleged indifference to Christianity had only further ruined his reputation in his hometown of Pembrokeshire.
Though, as well as this, William Roblin was involved in drunkenness, blasphemy, and failure to properly observe the holy day, otherwise known as the day of the Sabbath. He would spend his Sundays instead cockfighting, dogfighting, and sometimes outdoor gambling, much to the town's disapproval. Such activities were carried out with recklessness that got Mr. Roblin a bad reputation amongst the Pembrokeshire people. From this, many people suggest that William's later motivations for the murders he was accused of were much easier to understand. Mr. Roblin was an outcast who didn't have much of an easy life, though it didn't excuse the crime or crimes that he committed. In some ways, Mr. Roblin could be seen as a rather tragic character, having turned to drink in this way. Some say that he was clearly attempting to escape his mundane everyday life, though he eventually failed, as this drinking problem had been a major factor that led to his untimely death. However, with his fiery temper, drinking had only worsened things for Mr. Roblin, as his emotions were more susceptible to slipping away and growing into something he himself could not control. Many townsfolk, including his wife Margaret Roblin, admitted this in several reports concerning Mr. Roblin. In 1814, Mr. Roblin had found a job as a servant, most likely agricultural, to Richard Barsey on a family farm. Barsey had apparently often scolded Mr. Roblin for his brutal treatment of the animals on the farm. Mr. Roblin was recalled having been especially cruel to the animals after drinking, so Barsey threatened William with termination unless he changed his ways. Though Barsey never went through with his threat, as he suddenly died shortly after, on the 27th of February 1814, aged 71. There had been no clear evidence of foul play, and no cause of death, although rumours arose that the death was under suspicious circumstances, and that Mr. Roblin may have been to blame for the death. Furthermore, a large portion of Barsey's money that he kept in his house had also disappeared around a similar time. This had never been directly linked to William Roblin, though rumours only grew concerning this mystery. This, of course, only worked to further ruin Mr. Roblin's reputation even more. While working at that farm, Mr. Roblin met his future wife Margaret, who was also working there at the time. The couple courted and married the following year of meeting, with the marriage taking place at St. Petrock's Church. Soon after their marriage, they took a lease of a small farm that they called Deep Lake Farm in Ousmaston Parish, 3 miles from Haverfordwest. There, the couple also ran a public house in 1811. An alehouse licenses show how John Page opened an alehouse there in 1815, so many people suspect that Page was later succeeded by William Roblin in 1816. In the 4 or so years that Mr. Roblin ran the inn and lived in Deep Lake Farm, he attracted more of an undesirable reputation compared to before. Mr. Roblin had by then become a figure in the town who no one wanted to associate with. William became well known to break the bounds of the law for whoever he considered being his enemies or whoever offended him, however small the disagreement. With his wife, Williams had a single daughter known as Little Margaret. She had been described as sweet and an interesting girl in her 4th year, at the time of Mr. Roblin's execution. Throughout his life, Mr. Roblin would also cart materials for local farmers and buildings to maintain a healthy income for the Roblins family. However, during such deliveries, Mr. Roblin would beat his horse so badly that Mr. Jones, the prison governor, had to warn William not to do it again. Otherwise, he threatened that Mr. Roblin would be forced to stand in front of a magistrate. In response, Mr. Roblin pointedly replied that it was his own horse. Nevertheless, William thankfully never did it again, at least not in front of Mr. Jones. So, what crime did Mr. Roblin commit that caused him to be hung? William Roblin was sentenced to death by hanging after shooting a former employee in the head with a gun in a mad fury. It happened during one day in 1820, where Mr. Roblin fell into a heavy argument with his eventual victim, William Davis. However, Mr. Davis wasn't all that good of a person either. Mr. Davis was also described as hot-headed and bad-tempered, likewise to Mr. Roblin. Mr. Davis was known for having a hare lip and had actually previously served a 1-year sentence for an abhorrent crime. In March 1818, Mr. Davis had been convicted of flaying a calf whilst it was still alive. From this, Mr. Davis spent a year in custody and was released on the 10th of March 1819. Both Mr. Davis and Mr. Roblin were also known to have had bad blood on account of Mr. Roblin's bad habit and attitude, as well as unpaid wages that Mr. Roblin had failed to fix. Both intoxicated, they started to argue over unpaid wages during Mr. Davis's time working in the Deep Lake Farm under William Roblin. Mr. Roblin and Mr. Davies almost got physical with each other, but were prevented from doing so by a passerby. This was because one of the lime burners who was working there at the time split up the pair. Instead, both Mr. Roblin and Mr. Davies left town to resume the argument a couple miles outside of it. From this point, the argument grew worse and worse until Mr. Davies challenged William Roblin to a fight. It was then Mr. Roblin decided to retreat to his own home. Differing reports suggest that Mr. Roblin went home to retrieve his pistol to then shoot Mr. Davies at point blank range into the side of Mr. Davies' head. Other reports argue that instead, Davies pursued Roblin to Roblin's family home, pounding on the door and threatening Roblin. At this point, Margaret Roblin went outside to desperately persuade Davies to leave, fearful of her husband's explosive temper, especially as Roblin and Davies were incredibly drunk. From this, Mr. Roblin rushed outside where a single gunshot rang out. Instantly, Mr. Davies fell to the ground, bleeding excessively. Whichever account is correct, whatever was left of William Roblin's reputation was then in tatters. The wound Mr. Davies had suffered had been described as to the head, an inch wide and 3 inches deep. It was definitely a gruesome injury, from which Mr. Davies would later succumb to after a few more painful weeks hanging on to life. After the confrontation, Mr. Roblin went on the run, immediately recovering from his state of intoxication and stuck in a sheer state of panic. Usmaston Parish constables working together with special constables tried to hunt Mr. Roblin down, though to no avail. This was because Mr. Roblin knew the countryside and was so easily able to conceal himself in several different locations. While on the run, 2 constables encountered an old woman living at Silver Hill. What was different about this woman, however, compared to other potential witnesses' accounts, was her genuine fear of Mr. Roblin being anywhere nearby and near her home. Mr. Roblin had almost grown as a boogeyman type of reputation, which this woman seemed to take very seriously. The old woman promised both constables every possible assistance she could offer them if Mr. Roblin were to make any sort of appearance. In the end, she didn't turn out to be all that useful, as she wasn't able to or didn't want to turn in any information concerning Mr. Roblin. 18 days after the search started, locals, Griffiths and Corker, had spotted Roblin roaming in Caniston Woods alone. They pursued Mr. Roblin and demanded he surrender, but Mr. Roblin refused, instead of running away. But they reacted to this by discharging their firearms onto Mr. Roblin's, though their guns weren't terribly accurate, so eventually lost Mr. Roblin through the trees. After this, Lord Milford even offered a bounty of 40 guineas on Roblin's head, which was unusually large for that period. This didn't aid the capture of Mr. Roblin, so instead both Griffiths and Corker have rewarded 5 guineas each for their efforts. Instead, it was Mr. Roblin who decided to turn himself into a Mr. Phillips, a farmer residing at Maryborough in the parish of Wiston. Mr. Roblin begged the farmer to take him into Haverfordwest, where Mr. Roblin would later hand himself over to the police. William Roblin did this on the 4th of September 1820, hoping that turning himself in would give some kind of merit with the locals, as well as the law. On this day, he had been described as being in utter despair and desperation, but this didn't help William Roblin at all. From turning himself in, Mr. Roblin was never given a lighter sentence or any leeway from the Pembrokeshire constables. He was delivered into the custody of Mr. Jones, the prison governor. The next day, on the 5th of September, he was committed to Haverfordwest Gaol, where he was placed in Ward 7. Since his victim, Mr. Davies, was still alive at the time, in Haverfordwest's eminent surgeon, Mr. Roblin, had only been charged with battery at first. However, Mr. Davies died 3 agonising weeks after being shot, so William Roblin's charges were changed to murder, and he was sentenced and to be hung. Mr. Roblin denies these charges, though that didn't help him at all. During his time incarcerated, William Roblin even encountered a tale of how he was present in the cottage at Silver Hill. According to him, he was present while 2 constables were questioning the previously mentioned old woman from Silver Hill, who turned out was secretly hiding Mr. Roblin. Despite the old woman getting questioned by the 2 constables, Mr. Roblin got away with it and resumed life on the run afterward, as she never sold Mr. Roblin out to the law. In total, it took 3 days to convict William Roblin to be hung. Though Mr. Roblin had received no legal representation and no right to appeal his sentence during this time, suspicion had also arrived that Mr. Roblin's wife, Margaret Roblin, had been an accomplice to her husband. Margaret Roblin had even fled her home in Deep Lake for 2 days before she was detained by constables with Mr. Roblin's daughter, Little Margaret. There, Margaret and her daughter, Little Margaret, were taken into custody on the 15th of September 1820. They were later released on the 21st of April, 2 days before William Roblin's death, though without any contact with their husband and father from Mr. Roblin during that time. During Roblin's time in custody, Mr. Roblin had also attempted to commit suicide by hiding iron pins in the sleeve of his jacket. With these, Mr. Roblin intended to pierce several vital veins in different places to bleed to death. However, Mr. Roblin was unsuccessful in doing so, and stayed alive until his execution, saying, "Justice has not been done, but I shall have justice in another world." Mr. Roblin would repeatedly deny having killed William Davis, as well as denying even owning the pistol that was used to shoot Mr. Davis. This, however, was simply not true, as William Roblin had certainly shot Mr. Davis with a gun that Mr. Roblin himself owned. The date had been set for Monday, the 23rd of April, 1821. On the Monday before his execution, Mr. Roblin requested that he see his daughter, saying, "I shall never see her again after this." Recounts say that Mr. Roblin was very emotional, begging the prison governor at this time. His daughter and wife were being held in the same prison. On the 23rd of April at 6 o'clock in the morning, Mr. Roblin was hung. Mr. Roblin's last words when asked if he had any were, "No, I have nothing. I suppose you want me to confess the murders of which I am not guilty." Some people believe that this was about the mysterious death of the Irishman at his inn. William Roblin also added, "I am clear of that, why should I conceal it? They could do no more to me after." Reverend Adams asked him about it in the day of his execution. By this, Mr. Roblin meant that he had no reason to conceal any more information, having accepted his fate. A clergyman read a portion of the 55th chapter from Isaiah. Mr. Roblin reportedly hadn't even eaten since Friday, hence claimed to have a pain in his stomach. So, Mr. Roblin called for tobacco, since he enjoyed smoking, but kept his composure throughout the execution, right up until his grisly end. After calling for the tobacco, Mr. Roblin resumed his prayer until the drop fell. Some people say that Mr. Roblin hung from the Haverfordwest Castle gates, though this has never been fully confirmed or denied. However, we do know there was a lot of interest from the locals surrounding Mr. Roblin's hanging, as it was the first in the town after perhaps 10 years or more. At the point of death, Mr. Roblin was described as an inanimate corpse suspended between heaven and earth by onlookers. Historians think that thousands of people would have attended Mr. Roblin's execution, as it was a big deal at that time. However, after Mr. Roblin's hanging, his father, Richard Roblin, drunkenly promised to show and explain the bodies of both the Irishman and that of the unknown body that he claimed his son William Roblin had killed. Of course, his father promised this information in exchange for a rather grand £5. The second unknown body he spoke about was that of a woman who Roblin had buried in his orchard. In support of this, William Llewellyn, who also admitted that Mr. Roblin had told him about a similar story after Mr. Roblin drunkenly confiding in Mr. Llewellyn. To see if this was true, several people went to the site and dug up the orchard in search of this body, though nothing was found. Some people even speculate that Mr. Roblin lied for his own amusement, even through into the afterlife. Sadly, Mr. Roblin was ultimately never laid to rest in peace. Mr. Roblin's body was instead sold to a sailor as a mere curiosity, rather than respectable human remains. By 1914, Dr. Williams of St. David's had Mr. Roblin's remains moved to his house, though today Mr. Roblin's skull is now in Pembrokeshire Castle. It was on display for some time, though now has been placed into storage away from public eye. A lot of people dispute the proper handling that these remains have gone through, arguing that Mr. Roblin was never really given the full respect that he deserved, despite the horrific crimes that he was indeed guilty of committing. The rest of Mr. Roblin's skeleton has been long lost, but the skull still stands as a grisly reminder of his troubled life and the crimes that he committed these 200 years ago. The life and crimes committed by Mr. Roblin will never be forgotten about in the UK. If you would like to see more cases of old crimes committed in the UK, please let us know in the comments below. And as always, thank you for joining us and stay safe.
Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more content. Today we look at Stephen French, a notorious Liverpool gangster. Stephen French is a well-known name across the UK, as well as many other countries. Mr. French seems to be a jack of all trades, having a background in many different industries and constantly pursuing different courses of life. With a tangled life path and seemingly no straight destination, Mr. French has a story with lots of plot twists. Stephen French began his rise to criminality as early as 1972. Since then, Mr. French has been involved in a variety of crimes, such as petty theft and robbery, all the way to severe burglary and assault claims.
This UK gangster has brought other people into the world of organised crime as well as faced various charges throughout his lifetime, and spent numerous years in jail. The question is, what did a life of crime turn him into, and where did he end up today? Growing up in the 1960s, Mr. French did not have an easy childhood, nor was he able to be supported by a good family life at home. At an early age, Mr. French was removed from his family when it was discovered that his mother was not able to take care of him and his 4 siblings. Mr. French grew up in a town called Toxteth, a small inner city near Liverpool. While the elder 3 of his siblings were able to be put in the foster system after the family separation, Mr. French and his younger sibling were placed in a different type of care home because of their race. This unfortunate separation and discrimination may well have played a role into his deterrence from a normal life. The separation resulted in them growing up in a form of an orphanage, but under terrible conditions. Mr. French recalls that after meeting with a psychiatrist on many occasions, he ended up remembering suppressed memories from this part of his childhood. These are memories your brain hides on purpose because they cause damage to you at the time, so remembering them is hurtful and suppressing them helps you to feel better. Mr. French recounts that his care home was later shut down in the 1980s. During this shutdown, there were also about a dozen employees charged and tried for cases of physical and sexual abuse toward the children they tended for. From here on, Mr. French was involved in many activities of petty criminal activity during his childhood. Mr. French grew up with a very negative view of life, and also the idea that money was hard to come across. These 2 factors are commonly seen in the upbringing of soon-to-be criminals. A lot of teens that end up joining the world of street gangs don't have supportive families to rely on at home, and are commonly in dire need of money. As you can see, Mr. French was in a situation where both of these things were true for him, which as you can imagine cannot be easy to handle. Although this is no excuse for somebody to turn to the world of crime. This might explain what had happened to evolve such a life for him. For example, as the saying goes, both nature and nurture play a role in our lifetime's development. The environment you place a child in is almost always related to how their life ends up, and based on how he was raised, he was not put in a very good situation to make a life for himself. Interesting enough, aside from his life of street crime, Mr. French was also a professional mixed martial arts fighter, known as the Warrior. Mr. French had the record of being an ex-champion. He also had somewhat of a reputation in the film industry, and many TV appearances through 2008 to around 2019. He seems to have been well known in other industries, and not only for his gangster name that seemingly followed him wherever he went. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, when Mr. French was between his teenage years, he faced numerous charges and was already engulfed into the street gang life of petty crime. At this point, he was now involved in street criminal activity such as theft and house burglary. Mr. French has actually written a book about this, outlining the early stages of his life and how he spent his teenage years beginning to be involved in the gang activity. Since he was left without a support system at such a young age, we can assume that this is what led him into joining a street gang. This is an interesting viewpoint to how gangs can lure in children and why the enticement seems appealing. Young kids can sometimes be easily swayed against their will to joining this life of crime. However, this life doesn't turn out to be as good as the young kids think. Young teens are told they will have support from the group for life and will make enormous amounts of money from it. Children who join gangs at a young age are commonly roped in for life and begin to see the fierce consequences of not being able to leave the group. This is why gang members evolve their crime to grow from petty criminal activity to more serious arrest-worthy behaviours as they age. As the state of the drug business continued to prevail in Toxteth, Mr. French evolved and his behaviour grew with the times. With what he saw as an opportunity for fortune by abusing the people who had money to pay for drugs. By the time the late 80s and 90s came around, Mr. French was no longer involved in petty criminal activity and had moved on to robbing the richest people in the UK. Known as the taxer of the rich, Mr. French moved on to crime with a bigger reward, stealing from the most powerful crime lords in the UK. He knew these individuals had the most money to pay, and finding a way to take it from them was going to pay off big time. At this point, Mr. French was robbing city barons and torturing them until they pay large fines of money. These city barons were the largest illegal drug dealers across the UK, with large amounts of illicit money on them at all times. This was a prime opportunity in Mr. French's eyes to make a quick amount of money. These criminals could not report Mr. French to the government because their money is illicitly made, meaning if they report them, they're going to also be investigated. Mr. French manages to stay under the radar for quite some time, avoiding any serious fines or prison time at this point in his career. During the 80s and 90s, Mr. French managed to net over £20 million from these famous crime lords found across the UK. To take his illegal activity one step further, Mr. French was beginning to take youngsters from the gangs assimilated with him and turn them into criminals that followed his guide. A prime example of this is Curtis Warren. Curtis Warren began his career in gangster crime under the wing of Mr. French, who taught him his techniques and gave a way to make his own money across the streets. Mr. Warren ended up being named one of Britain's biggest drug dealers, actually titled as one of the richest men in the UK in 1997. Mr. Warren advanced his career from street crime and created a worldwide web of trafficking, generating huge amounts of illegal money that would end up leading him to some serious jail time. Once this network across the world was detected by authorities, Mr. Warren was put behind bars after failing to pay back £198 million. French pretty much brought up to one of the UK's most notorious criminals, who to this day is still in prison. It is clear to see that Mr. French has had a building career of crime since his early childhood. This again speaks on the ability of gangs to take a young child without a good support system and convince them to rely on illegal activity to make their way in life. Mr. French's story doesn't get much better from here, only starting to spiral downwards into worse activities that end up landing him in some jail time. What is interesting about Mr. French is that he does not follow a straight or usual life of a street criminal. Mr. French created a really distinctive name for himself, being a self-proclaimed peace activist and also an anti-gun campaigner. Mr. French also did grow up in a very rich lifestyle, and although started off in an orphanage with no family and nearly no money, did end up making lots of capital off property investments. This goes to show that he had an opportunity to clean his life up and distance himself from criminal activity. Mr. French goes on for nearly 10 years after some of his petty crime charges to portray himself as a highly reformed Christian and a peace provider. This is interesting because even after living a life of prompting peace and within communities and having a stand-up job for himself, his reputation is still to be damaged in the future with these allegations and incarcerations that are soon to come. This nice guy reputation does not last for very long and continues to be broken apart when his crime stories return to the media yet again. Once he moved on from petty burglary and car theft, Mr. French ended up in some more serious situations. In 2009, Mr. French was tried and put in jail for 3 years after being caught possessing a knife and threatening one of his business associates with a fake firearm. This incarceration is one of the first events leading up to the rest of his jail time and charges that are pressed later on in his life. He is again incarcerated for pistol whipping or using a handgun as a weapon of blunt force a fellow businessman. He later tossed the essentially fake gun as well as a machete into the nearby river, the River Mersey. Mr. French was handed a 3-year term for attacking said businessman at an office complex near Liverpool City. After only spending approximately 2 years behind bars, Mr. French was released to live on parole according to some very strict conditions. As you may know, parole conditions and rules are serious, and any breach can land you back in prison just as quickly as you were released. However, this release again doesn't last very long. Although Mr. French was given the specific limitations of what he was allowed to do while he was out of jail, it's been reported that rather than stick to these guidelines and report to the probation centre as directed, he chose to live by his own will and go against these rules. In 2015, Mr. French was caught on photograph sitting at a Liverpool soccer game next to one of the football stars. This media attention is one of the things that brought him back into the spotlight at nearly 55 years old. Mr. French was caught breaking the rules of his probation, which landed him back in jail in order to finish his sentence from 2013's assault charges. This is another time when the media attention was almost fully set on him, exemplifying how he continued to switch back from a life of crime to a life of being a peace campaigner. Nobody could understand the constant changes in direction. After serving the rest of his sentence in 2013's conviction, Mr. French again stayed out of the media eye for the next few years. However, if you've been following the story so far, you can probably guess that this isn't the end yet. In 2016, Mr. French's story makes a really interesting twist, this time in an unfortunate manner for him. Although Mr. French has been in and out of jail and fighting convictions for the majority of his life, this time he faced allegations of a more serious criminal activity. Charged with 2 counts of rape and lethal threats, Mr. French appeared in court during April of 2016 to fight back against these allegations. It seems fair to say that based on his history, the odds were most likely not in his favour, regardless of whether he is guilty or not. It seems almost impossible that the courts will side with him at this point. The women who came forward with the allegations against him seem to have a very disheartening story about the tales she was telling him. Coming from a life of crime with multiple jail times and incarcerations behind him, Mr. French didn't seem like the most honest and trustworthy guy, making it really hard for the courts to believe him when he was denying these allegations. At 56 years old, Mr. French was being charged with 2 rape allegations. Even more so, this woman's son filed that Mr. French made threats to kill him as well. These trials took place at the Liverpool Crown Court. The son had heard an argument between Mr. French and his mother happening in the house. He says that he could hear what sounded like spitting going on between them, as if they were angry with each other. First his mum spitting at Mr. French, and then the return. Out of curiosity and apprehension, the son approached the area of the house where Mr. French and his mother were, and found his mum lying on the floor in obvious pain. Although the son cannot claim to have seen Mr. French commit any physical act, he naturally tried to push Mr. French away, out of the assumption that Mr. French had hurt his mother. Following this, the son tells the court that Mr. French aggressively approached him during this situation and threatens to kill everyone in the family if he gets him arrested. Knowing Mr. French's reputation and fearing that the threat did hold some truth to it, the son took action instead of shrugging it off. The mother and son contacted the police, and so these charges were made. However, this case doesn't end there. Mr. French completely denied any accusation of raping the woman. With a good defence lawyer on his side, the charges ended up being dropped when there was no evidence of the act of sexual abuse. His defence lawyer also claimed that some of the prosecution's evidence was in fact faulty and totally unreliable. Mr. French did, however, plead guilty to the charge of threatening the son, and so these charges were continued accordingly. From here, Mr. French was given 16 weeks in prison and a 5-year-long restraining order against the family, after admitting to threatening the son that day. He was legally recorded as not guilty for the 2 counts of rape and assault. So Mr. French again ended up in prison, possibly for one of the more violent allegations he faced over his lifetime. Although most of his crimes were fraudulent acts of robbery, this media attention was much worse. Now finished with his most recent sentence, Mr. French has again returned to his character of a reborn Christian, running anti-gun campaigns and peace protests. Known as the fighting preacher, French seems to be trying this more devout path of life and possibly straying away from the street crime and gangs. However, this does not seem to be the first time he has taken a break, since his life route is far from being normal. Many individuals have gone public with their statements and thoughts about Mr. French, stating that coming out of a life of crime is difficult to do. Although Mr. French may very well want to live a normal life and forget about his younger, less modest days, these demons are not so easy to let go of. A big issue spoken about on his behalf is the amount of people looking to cause some harm to him. After all, he stole from and tormented so many big-name criminals back in the time of illegal activity that it seems he will forever have to watch his back. The so-called devil could very well have a genuine desire to live opposite to how people know and remember him, but this could prove to be difficult. Mr. French is known as an advocate for anti-gun violence despite his past, as well as being a supporter of the Christian religion. Mr. French is now devoted to living his life to helping others, which includes showing young people why they should stay away from the life of crime. In many of his interviews, he discusses how he uses his own experiences to teach people to stay away from organised crime. No matter your living conditions, even with a life in and out of prison, he seems to act quite as an advocate for being on your best behaviour. On another strange note, Mr. French also frequently discusses the difference between his crimes and the crimes we are seeing happening now. It is as though he believes his form of criminal behaviour is somehow above others, placing himself as one of the better robbers and thieves in history. He often discusses how his form of crime was to rob someone, tie them up and walk away with the money in his pocket. This in comparison to today's world, where we see more of gun violence and unnecessary killings. It is indeed an interesting comparison, but not something that's unheard of from old school criminals who think of themselves above these younger criminals who perform almost identical acts. This is especially true for Mr. French, as he does have a history of charges against him for assault and violent cases in his younger days. However, if we are to take a look at where he is now, Mr. French seems to be living almost his normal life, or a life as normal as it can be for an ex-criminal with such a deep history. It's not every day that you see somebody with a background such as himself be able to broadcast themselves as being a person with such high values and a peaceful reputation. Seemingly bouncing back from crime to a heavy religious life, and even leading peace protests and civil rights movements. Mr. French has been involved with a lot of high-level criminals throughout his lifetime, and some who may always have bad blood towards him. Regardless of personal opinion on Mr. French, he has been through a lot throughout his life, and gained so much experience that he is now able to tell his story and help those who might be growing up in a similar circumstance as himself to find a way to change or take a better path. We hope Mr. French is able to continue spreading his knowledge to the younger generation and is able to stay focused and not get drawn back into the criminal underworld. The life and crimes committed by Stephen French will never be forgotten about in the UK criminal underworld.
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us. Please like, share and subscribe for more content. Today we'll be looking at the life of a very famous criminal, Mr. Ivan Graham, who is also dubbed to be the crime lord Mr. Big, who ran a £35 million empire of drugs and guns. Over the course of 2 years, Mr. Graham was involved in a distribution network that pushed tens of millions of pounds of drugs into towns and cities across the Midlands. He was a drugs kingpin who distributed a staggering £35 million worth of heroin and cocaine from his suburban home. The level of activity in the property was quite frankly staggering. In shutting this operation down, a major supplier of drugs who has and would have continued to cause untold misery to thousands of families across Derbyshire and the wider region has been cut off. Police said drugs arrived at Mr. Graham's house in their raw form, and after being cut and repackaged they were then supplied to other dealers for sale. Mr. Graham of Whetstone Drive, Rugby, was dubbed Mr. Big by neighbours. A police raid at a home owned by Mr. Graham uncovered 4 terrifying loaded weapons, including an Uzi submachine gun fitted with a silencer, a Walther PPK 22 caliber pistol, and a Smith & Wesson 38 caliber revolver, and 1 stun gun disguised as a firearm. Officers also seized 5 kilograms of cocaine, 3.6 kilograms of heroin, 1 kilogram of crack cocaine, and 40 kilograms of cannabis, and more than £350,000 in used notes during a 2-day raid at the property in Derby. It took police officers more than 2 days to search the property after the raid at an address in Wakami Crescent, Chelseaton, Derby. Beat officers stood guard as others searched the house on May 22, 2018. The vast amount of drugs and the 4 loaded weapons were removed. Also discovered at the property was £354,000 in cash. It was previously stated in court that more than 1,000 exhibits were found, which helped the prosecution prepare its case against Mr. Graham. One of the areas that was searched was a back garden shed, and in that shed were hundreds of bin bags full of wraps, which relate to kilos of drugs. It is to be believed that there are 2 years worth of wraps there. Mr. Graham was conducting industrial scale drug operations that in less than 2 years saw £35 million worth of Class A substances pass through a quiet residential street in Derby. The loaded Uzi submachine gun fitted with a silencer was one of 4 fearsome weapons discovered at a bedroom at the Chelseaton address. A drawer full of banknotes was just one of the Wakami Crescent properties that saw officers remove more than £350,000 in cash from 2 days. In the cooker you could see lots and lots of blocks of crack cocaine which was made by a drug kingpin Mr. Graham in the kitchen at the address. A drawer full of cannabis was among the 35 kilograms discovered around the house. And although the shed full of bin bags looked harmless, stuffed inside each of them was packaging from the original high purity cocaine and heroin imported from abroad by Mr. Graham. Analysis carried out by police enabled them to conservatively estimate that from July 2016 to May 2018, £35 million worth of drugs would have gone through the address. This was a well-organised criminal enterprise, and Mr. Graham played a leading role in it. He had the ability to obtain significant quantities of high-purity Class A drugs from source. Analysis of the drugs and packaging seized at the address at Wakami Crescent showed 996 kilograms, almost a metric ton, of Class A drugs could have gone through it in less than 2 years, and that's a conservative estimate. The case began with a routine street arrest on May 22nd, when 2 officers on uniformed patrol stopped Mr. Graham shortly after he left the property. They let themselves into the address using his front door key and having been greeted by the sight of large quantities of drugs. They immediately called for help, and Mr. Langdale, over the next 2 days, police conducted a search through the entire property. He then detailed exactly what was discovered in which cupboards, drawers, bags and storage units were found. In total, they discovered 35 kilograms of cannabis, 5.2 kilograms of cocaine, 3.6 kilograms of heroin, 625 grams of crack cocaine, and £354,795 in used notes, which was removed from the home. A number of hydraulic presses, which are also used to compact down packets of powdered drugs, were found. Numerous sets of digital scales were found in many of the rooms, as well as Pakistani rupees, which still remain a mystery to the day. The address was being used for an industrial-sized enterprise, which saw the storage, cutting, production and wholesale supply of Class A drugs on a level so vast that it is unprecedented within the Midlands. The property in Wakami Crescent is understood now to be occupied by a new tenant and is in no way part of the police investigations. This offence took place in a quiet street alongside people going about their law-abiding business. The police soon mentioned that they have cut off a major supplier who would have continued to cause untold misery. Mr. Graham pleaded guilty to 3 counts of possession of a Class A drug with intent, possession of a Class B drug with intent, producing a Class A drug, 2 counts of supplying a Class A drug, supplying a Class B drug, 2 counts of possessing a firearm with intent, possessing a prohibited firearm, possessing a disguised firearm, possessing criminal property, and possessing ammunition without a firearm certificate. He was sentenced to 24 years in prison at Derby Crown Court. Judge Robert Egbunda said, "You are clearly deeply rooted in the underworld, and drugs are a way of life for you." This was a well-organised criminal enterprise, and Mr. Graham played a leading role in it. He had the ability to obtain significant quantities of high-purity Class A drugs from the source. The people of Derby are safer now that this weapon, along with others found at the address, is off the streets. Criminals like Mr. Graham should be looking over their shoulder at all times, because the police will catch up to them, and when they do, they'll bring the full force of the law to bear on them. Judge Martin Nolan sentenced Mr. Graham to 6 years in prison and Mr. Pelkovic to 4.5 years. They were caught red-handed in a taxi in possession of the drugs. Mr. Pelkovic had a previous conviction for money laundering. The 2 English men smuggled more than €500,000 worth of cocaine into the country and were jailed at Dublin Circuit Criminal Court. Mr. Graham and Mr. Pelkovic of Chime Close, Oakwood, Derby, pleaded guilty to possession of cocaine for sale or supply at Perse Square, Perse Street, Dublin on April 10, 2008. Judge Martin Nolan said that it would be unfair to impose the presumptive mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in this case, as these were 2 young gentlemen who were making very little money from the drugs. He acknowledged that Mr. Graham made admissions, pleaded guilty, and showed remorse that he was prepared to accept the risk involved with a huge amount of drugs for a small level of profit, and he accepted that Mr. Pelkovic was not involved in the same degree, but that he had to consider his previous serious convictions for money laundering. He said that he had a chance to back out but didn't. The Garda National Drugs Unit stopped a taxi at Purr Square after mounting a surveillance operation. The two accused were sitting in the back of the vehicle and Mr. Graham had a black holdall bag on his lap. Just more than 8 kilograms of cocaine was found in the bag, which was valued at €563,000. Mr. Graham admitted his involvement when questioned, saying, "You have me red-handed," and you told him that he agreed to transport the package to clear £2,000 of a £30,000 debt. Mr. Graham said he was afraid to go back to England in case he'd be shot dead. Mr. Pelkovic became involved in the venture to pay off a debt which had arisen after he was convicted for money laundering. Mr. Pelkovic said that the people he owed money to were putting pressure on him to pay them back. Mr. Pelkovic was not party to the nitty-gritty of the deal and was hired as muscle, but when he realised drugs were in the bag, he chose to remain involved. Mr. Graham had demonstrated a significant degree of honour and personal risk in admitting that he was more involved in the venture than Mr. Pelkovic, and that he had been cynically targeted by the police he was indebted to. Mr. Pelkovic could have denied knowing that the drugs were involved, but instead made full admissions when questioned. Mr. Owen Manahan, Mr. Hafiz Soul and Mr. Troy Colbert were sentenced to prison for their part in the conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, namely cocaine, crack cocaine and heroin, after a long-running police operation by the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, the EMSOU, dating back to 2017. The first arrest took place on the Thursday, the 7th of December 2017, when Mr. Manahan was arrested after his car was stopped on the A38 by a traffic officer at 8:45 p.m. Mr. Manahan had driven to Birmingham and was on the way back to Derby when the car eventually pulled over for the officer initially after failing to stop. The officer immediately smelt a strong smell of cannabis and called for support to search the vehicle. Inside the vehicle was found £940 in £20 notes and cannabis worth an estimated street value of around £800. The second arrest took place on Wednesday the 17th of January 2018 when Mr. Hafiz Soul was arrested after his car, a Seat Leon, was stopped in Uttoxeter, Old Road, Derby. Inside the car was an amount of cocaine found in various bags and a search of his home was ordered. At his home address in James Close, Derby, a large quantity of drugs were found, including crack cocaine, cocaine and diamorphine. The cocaine found in the car and the house in James Close were of very high purity and were given a street value of up to £278,000. A number of mobile phones were seized in the car which showed drug dealing activity, including images and videos of drugs and drug dealing paraphernalia. A BlackBerry was also seized and was found to have encryption software in an effort to hide the activity taking place on the device. Over the intervening months, further investigations were carried out into the offences of Mr. Soul and Mr. Manahan when a significant development occurred in May. Forensic work carried out on the cash seized at Mr. Graham's address found the fingerprints of Mr. Manahan and another man, Mr. Troy Colbert. Following the arrest of Mr. Ivan Graham, Mr. Manahan, Mr. Soul and Mr. Colbert were all arrested again at their homes on Tuesday, the 4th of September 2018. Mr. Colbert was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to supply controlled drugs at his home in Elm Park Court, Derby. Quantities of drugs and cash were found along with 2 mobile phones. Mr. Soul was arrested on the same charge at his home in James Close, Derby, and inside the property were found a small set of digital scales and drug dealing paraphernalia. Mr. Manahan was also arrested on the same charge and found in possession of £1,300 in cash and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Mr. Colbert was sentenced in his absence to 8 years in prison. Detective Inspector Mr. Richard Monk, who led the investigation into the trio, said that today's sentencing is the culmination of more than 3 years of hard work to disrupt and dismantle a high-level drugs network. The trio were benefiting to the tune of thousands of pounds as they peddled potentially lethal drugs that cause untold misery in our communities. And it is the communities that are affected by this, and that the police rely on the public being aware of what is going on in their local area and helping provide information that can make their communities safer. A A trio of drug dealers linked to Mr. Graham were recently sentenced to more than 13 years in prison for their involvement in a multi-million-pound drug operation. The three dealers were caught red-handed buying large quantities of high-purity cocaine from two Chaddison brothers, Mr. Ross Stroud and Mr. Bradley Fowles. Mr. Ben Rogerson would arrange to meet Mr. Kirk and Mr. Luke Guy, who have pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and will be sentenced at a later date, in pub car parks, a gym or rural locations, and hand over in exchange for drugs. The cocaine supplied by the Guys was sourced from Mr. Graham, who was responsible for importing vast quantities of drugs into the Midlands from a base at his home in Wakami Crescent, Chelston. The Guy brothers brought their cocaine from Graham, and in turn the trio of dealers who were sentenced at Derby Crown Court purchased large amounts to sell onto their customer base. Following a deal at the Rose and Crown pub, Morley, officers attempted to pull over Mr. Stroud's personalised registration Range Rover, but the 28-year-old led officers on an 80-mile-an-hour chase through Alkston and Kirk Hallam in an unsuccessful bid to escape. His attempt to flee landed him with charges of dangerous driving, which he also pleaded guilty to. Mr. Stroud of Tulip Road, Allsworth, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and was jailed for 5 years and disqualified from driving for 3.5 years. Mr. Fowles of Featherstone Close, Gedling, Nottingham, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and possessing criminal property and was jailed for 5 years and 3 months due to a previous conviction for drugs. Mr. Rogerson of Wildhay Brook, Hilton, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A drugs and was jailed for 3 years. Drugs don't just impact those who abuse them, they tear families apart, they cause marriages to break down and jobs to be lost. The negative impact their drug dealing has on our society is unquantifiable, and we must continue to target those involved, no matter how hard they try to avoid detection or cover their tracks. Do you think the sentence Mr. Graham served was adequate or unfair? Let us know in the comments section down below. And if you liked the video, don't forget to drop us a like and subscribe for more content.
Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and a share, and leave any thoughts or suggestions you have in the comments section. We love to read through them all. And if you're new but enjoy UK true crime content, then subscribe to see when our newest video releases. And as always, stay safe.